Hey, welcome back. I am so glad you are here tonight. If you are new to this channel, welcome to Chrono Snooze. Pull that blanket up a little closer. Find the soft spot on your pillow. Let the room get quiet around you. Because tonight we are going somewhere very old. Somewhere cold and windswept and strange. Somewhere that smells of wood smoke and animal fur and the salt of a distant sea. And I promise you, it is nothing like what you've been imagining. Close your eyes for just a moment. Picture this. It is the year 870. You are somewhere on the western coast of Norway, though you would not call it Norway. That word does not exist yet, not in the way we use it. You are lying on your side, wrapped in a heavy sheepskin, on a raised wooden platform about 2 feet off the ground. The surface beneath you is hard, not cruel, but honest, packed earth and timber, softened only slightly by a layer of straw and the animal hides piled on top of it. The air around you is thick, not unpleasant exactly, but dense in a way that modern air never is. Smoke. That is the first thing you notice, not the sharp, choking smoke of something burning badly, but the deep, slow, embedded smell of a fire that has been burning in the same room for months, possibly years. It is in the walls, it is in the timber above your head, it is in the furs you're lying under, it is in your hair and your clothing and the skin of the person sleeping beside you. Smoke is not a feature of this room, it is the room. And then you hear something, a low sound, rhythmic and soft, coming from somewhere to your left in the darkness. Breathing, but not human breathing. Deeper, slower, with a warm animal weight to it. A cow, maybe 2. Standing in the far end of this same building, separated from you by nothing more than a low wooden partition and the long orange glow of the central fire. You have just woken up in a Viking Longhouse. And the world around you, once your eyes begin to adjust and your senses begin to map the space, is one of the most extraordinary domestic environments in all of human history. Now, before we go any further, if this kind of storytelling is something that makes your evenings a little slower, a little richer, a little more interesting, it would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and gave this video a like. And I am genuinely curious. Where are you right now as you listen to this? Tucked into bed, on the couch with the lights off, maybe driving somewhere late at night with the headlights cutting through the dark? Drop it in the comments. I love reading every single one. Now, dim the lights if you can. Maybe let a fan run softly in the background. Let the world outside go quiet for a little while. And let us step properly into this world, because the building you have just woken up inside is not just a house. It is an entire civilization compressed into a single room. Here is something that genuinely stopped me when I first started researching this topic. We use the word house so casually. 4 walls, a roof, some rooms, a door. We barely think about it. But the Viking Longhouse was not a house in any sense that we would recognize today. It was simultaneously a home, a barn, a workshop, a kitchen, a bedroom, a meeting hall, a storage facility, and on certain evenings a temple. One building, one room, essentially. And everything that mattered in a family's life happened inside it. The archaeological record for Viking Age longhouses is extraordinary. Hundreds of them have been excavated across Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland, the Faroe Islands, and the British Isles. And what those excavations reveal consistently across different regions and different centuries is a building type so well adapted to its environment that it survived with remarkably little change for nearly 1,000 years. Let me walk you through what this building actually looked like. Because once you understand the structure, once you can feel the weight of it, and the logic behind every beam and every stone, everything else about the life lived inside it begins to make sense. The longhouse was, as its name suggests, long. The average longhouse from the Viking Age measured somewhere between 15 and 30 metres in length, roughly 50 to 100 feet. Some were considerably larger. The Great Chieftain's Hall at Borg in the Lofoten Islands of northern Norway, excavated in the 1980s, stretched to 83 metres. That is over 270 feet long, the length of a modern city block. A single domestic building in which one extended family and their household lived, worked, and sheltered their animals through the Arctic winter. But here is the thing about the longhouse that most people do not expect. It was not wide. The typical longhouse was only about 5 to 7 metres across, maybe 16 to 23 feet. That is not much wider than a modern living room, and when you step inside one, when you stand in the reconstructed longhouses that exist today, at places like the Lofoten Viking Museum in Norway or the Settlement Museum at Stong in Iceland, the first thing that strikes you is not the length. It is the narrowness, the intimacy, the sense that every person in this building is within arm's reach of every other person at almost all times. The walls were thick. In Norway and Iceland, where timber was scarce in many regions, the outer walls were built from turf, blocks of earth cut from the ground with the grass still attached, stacked like enormous, slightly irregular bricks to a thickness of a metre or more. Sometimes stone formed the base layer, and turf was piled on top. In Denmark and parts of southern Scandinavia, where wood was more available, the walls might be constructed using a technique called stave building, where vertical planks were set into a timber frame and sealed with clay or moss. Or the turf walls are important because they explain something about the longhouse that most illustrations and films get completely wrong. A turf-walled longhouse from the outside did not look like a building. It looked like a hill, a low, grassy, gently sloping mound rising from the earth, with smoke drifting from a gap near the ridge of the roof, and perhaps a single dark doorway visible at one end. If you were walking across a Norse farmstead in the year 900, you might not even realize you were looking at someone's home until you were practically standing on it. And that is not an accident. The turf walls were not a primitive substitute for something better. They were an engineering solution of extraordinary sophistication. A metre-thick wall of a living turf provided insulation that rivals modern construction standards. It kept heat in during the winter, when temperatures in coastal Norway could drop well below freezing for months at a time. It stayed cool in the brief summers. It absorbed sound. It resisted wind in a landscape where the wind was not a gentle breeze but a constant, battering, horizontal presence that could strip an exposed wooden structure in a matter of years. The roof was similarly constructed. Heavy timber beams, often curved to form a gentle arch, supported a lattice of lighter wood over which layers of birch bark were laid for waterproofing, and then turf was piled on top. The combined weight of all that earth and timber and grass was enormous, which is why the interior of the longhouse was punctuated by 2 parallel rows of massive wooden posts running the full length of the building. These posts, usually made from the sturdiest oak or pine available, bore the weight of the roof and divided the interior space into 3 long aisles, a wide central aisle and 2 narrower side aisles. Think of it almost like a very simple church if a church were built half underground and filled with smoke and sleeping people and livestock. The central aisle was the communal space, the living and working area. The side aisles, slightly raised above the central floor on packed earth platforms, were the sleeping and storage areas. And those raised platforms are where you're lying right now, wrapped in your sheepskin, listening to the cow breathe in the darkness. Now, I want you to feel something about this building that I think is easy to miss when you're reading about it in a textbook. The Longhouse had almost no windows. In some longhouses there were none at all. In others, small openings high in the gable ends might let in a thin blade of light during the day, but they were small enough that they could be stuffed with wadding or an animal bladder stretched across a wooden frame to keep out the cold. Glass, in Viking Age Scandinavia, was a luxury item, used for beads and drinking vessels, not for windows. What this means in practical terms is that the inside of a longhouse was dark, not dim, dark. During the winter months when the sun in northern Norway might rise for only 3 or 4 hours a day, and even then might not climb above the horizon, the interior of the longhouse existed in a state of near-permanent twilight. The only light came from the fire. The long, narrow hearth that ran down the centre of the building, sometimes for the entire length of the hall, produced a low, shifting amber glow that lit the faces of the people nearest to it, and left everything beyond the first few feet dissolving into shadow. And the smoke from that fire, because there was no chimney, not in the way we understand the word, the smoke rose from the flames and drifted upward until it hit the underside of the roof, where it spread out and hung in a thick, slowly swirling layer. A small gap or opening at the ridge of the roof allowed some of the smoke to escape, but the ventilation was never complete. The upper third of the longhouse interior was essentially a permanent cloud of wood smoke. This sounds unbearable to modern ears, and honestly for the first hour or so it probably was, even for the people who lived there. Your eyes would sting, your throat would catch. But here is the remarkable thing. The smoke served a purpose, several purposes actually, that made it not just tolerable, but genuinely useful. The constant low-level smoke preserved the timber of the roof structure, effectively smoking it the way you would smoke a piece of fish, making it resistant to rot and insect damage. It helped keep flies and mosquitoes away during the summer months, which in the wetlands and coastal areas of Scandinavia could be a genuine plague, and it contributed to the preservation of food, meat and fish hung from the rafters in the smoky upper reaches of the longhouse would cure slowly over weeks, protected from spoilage by the same compounds that were protecting the wood. The people who lived inside this environment developed, over generations, a tolerance for smoke that modern researchers have noted with a mixture of respect and mild alarm. Archaeological analysis of skeletal remains from Viking Age Scandinavia frequently reveals evidence of chronic respiratory conditions, thickened sinus passages, and the kind of lung damage associated with long-term smoke inhalation. They paid a physical price for this arrangement. But the alternative, a building without a fire in a Norwegian winter, was not an alternative at all. It was a death sentence. I want to pause here for a moment because I think we have reached the first point where the Viking Longhouse starts to reveal something important about the people who built it. This was not a people who had failed to invent the chimney and were waiting for someone to come along and show them a better way. This was a people who had made a series of deeply pragmatic calculations about what their environment required and what they could afford to sacrifice. The smoke was the cost of warmth, the darkness was the cost of insulation, the closeness, the cramped, perpetual intimacy of 20 or 30 people living and sleeping and working in a single narrow room was the cost of survival, and they did not experience it as suffering, not most of the time, because this is the thing that I keep returning to when I study this period, and it is something I think we genuinely struggle to understand from our modern vantage point. Comfort is relative. What feels unbearable to you tonight, lying in your warm bed with the lights exactly where you want them, and the temperature controlled to within a degree, would have felt like an impossible luxury to a person in the year 870 who had never known anything other than this. And what feels cramped and smoky and primitive to us was, to them, home, the only home they had ever known. And they built it with their own hands, and they kept it warm through winters that would break most of us, and they raised their children in it, and told their stories in it, and when the time came, they mourned their dead in it. There is a kind of courage in that, not the dramatic courage of a battlefield, the ordinary, unglamorous, daily courage of people who looked at an unforgiving world and said, "This is what we have and we will make it work." And they did. Now, the doorway. Let us talk about the doorway for a moment, because it is a surprisingly telling detail. Most longhouses had their main entrance in one of the long side walls, not at the end, which is what you might expect. The door was typically placed slightly off-centre, and it was built low, lower than a modern doorway by a considerable margin. You would have to duck, sometimes significantly, to pass through it. This was not an oversight, it was deliberate. A low doorway forced anyone entering the building to lower their head, which meant they could not easily rush in swinging a weapon. It was a security feature built into the architecture itself, a quiet acknowledgement that the world outside the longhouse walls was not always safe, and that the threshold between inside and outside was a boundary worth defending. Stepping through that doorway, you crossed from one world into another. Outside, the wind, the rain, the vast and often threatening landscape. Inside, the warmth, the fire, the sound of human voices and animal breath. The longhouse was not just shelter. It was the boundary between the known and the unknown, between the domestic world where people had control and the wild world where they did not. And that boundary, I think, is part of why the longhouse holds such power in our imagination, even 1,000 years later. It is the oldest story there is. The fire in the darkness, the walls against the wind, the circle of warmth where the people you love are gathered, and the cold outside that makes the warmth mean something. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because right now, in the thin grey light of a Scandinavian morning, you're still lying on that platform, wrapped in your sheepskin, and something is pulling you slowly, reluctantly toward wakefulness. Not an alarm, not a phone, something older and considerably less negotiable. That is exactly where we're going next. So here you are, still lying on the raised sleeping platform inside the longhouse, the heavy sheepskin pulled up to your chin, your body curled toward the warmth of the person beside you. And something is changing. You do not open your eyes yet. You do not need to. You can feel it. A shift in the quality of the darkness behind your eyelids, not bright, not morning in the way we experience morning, with daylight flooding through curtains and the world outside already humming. This is something much more tentative, a thin, grey, almost reluctant lightness creeping through the smoke hole in the roof, touching the upper edges of the room and leaving everything below in shadow. In a Norwegian coastal winter, this might be all the light the day intends to give you, 3 hours of twilight, perhaps 4, and then the dark returns. But you're not waking because of the light. You're waking because of sound. First, the animals. In the far end of the longhouse, separated from the living quarters by a low wooden partition, and sometimes nothing more than a change in the floor level from packed earth to stone, the livestock are stirring. You can hear the cows shifting their weight, the soft thud of a hoof on compacted ground, the low murmur that cattle make when they are awake and waiting. There might be sheep in there too, packed together for warmth, their wool thick with lanolin. Perhaps a few goats, which in the Viking Age were valued not only for their milk and meat but for their skins, which made some of the finest leather available. This arrangement, humans and animals sharing the same building, is one of the details about the Viking Longhouse that most surprises people when they first encounter it. We find it strange today, this idea of sleeping 30 feet from a cow, but the logic behind it was impeccable. Every living body generates heat. A single adult cow produces roughly the same thermal output as a small space heater. 3 or 4 cattle, a handful of sheep, a few goats, all of them radiating warmth through the long northern night. The byre end of the longhouse functioned as a biological heating system, raising the temperature of the entire building by several critical degrees, and the animals needed to be inside, not just for their own protection, though a Norwegian winter could kill exposed livestock with brutal efficiency, but because these animals represented the family's wealth. In a world without banks, without currency as we understand it, without any of the abstract financial instruments that modern economies depend on, your cattle were your savings account. A family that lost its livestock to cold or predators in a hard winter was a family facing genuine ruin. So you brought them inside, you shared your roof with them, you listened to them breathe in the darkness, and in return they kept you a little warmer than you would otherwise have been. Now, here is something I want you to really sit with for a moment, because it changes the way you hear this story. The sleeping platform you are lying on is not a bed in any sense that we would use the word. There is no mattress, there is no frame, there is no box spring, no pillow as we know it. What there is a raised section of earth, packed hard and topped with planks of wood, running the length of the longhouse along both side walls. The surface is covered with straw, which was changed periodically, and over the straw are animal hides, sheepskin mostly, but also cowhide, goatskin, and in wealthier households, the furs of bears and wolves and seals. You slept in your clothes, not because you were being modest, but because it was cold. The fire in the centre of the longhouse burned through the night, yes, but its heat was concentrated along the central aisle. The sleeping platforms set against the outer walls where the thick turf insulation met the interior air were warmer than the outside world by a considerable margin, but they were not warm in the way your bedroom is warm right now. On a bitter night in January, with the wind hammering against the turf walls and the temperature outside well below freezing, the temperature on the sleeping platform might have been somewhere in the range of 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Survivable, not comfortable. You pulled the furs over yourself and you pressed close to whoever was sleeping beside you, and you were grateful for the fire and for the cattle, and for the walls that kept the wind from finding you directly. The order of who slept where in the longhouse was not random. It was a precise reflection of the social hierarchy of the household, and getting it right mattered. The head of the household, the farmer, the chieftain, whatever his status, slept on the raised platform closest to the high seat, which was a special wooden seat or bench positioned at the centre of one of the long walls, directly opposite the main entrance. This was the most honoured position in the entire building. The high seat was often marked by elaborately carved wooden pillars on either side, and in the sagas, the stories that the Norse people told and retold for generations, the high seat was not just furniture. It was a symbol of authority, of legitimacy, of the right to lead. The farmer's wife slept beside him. Their children were nearby, arranged by age. Household members of lower status, including the Thralls, the unfree labourers who occupied the lowest rung of Norse society, slept further from the centre, closer to the doors, closer to the cold, closer to the animals. In the largest longhouses, those belonging to wealthy chieftains or regional lords, there might be additional sleeping areas separated by woven screens or wooden partitions, creating something approaching private space for the most important members of the household. But for most families, privacy in the modern sense simply did not exist. You fell asleep listening to your family, you woke up the same way. I want to be honest with you about something here, because I think it is important to name. The idea of 30 people sleeping in one room, with no privacy, no personal space, no ability to close a door and be alone, sounds claustrophobic to us. It sounds suffocating. We are people who've been trained by centuries of increasing individualism to believe that personal space is a right, that solitude is necessary for mental health, that a closed door is the minimum requirement for a dignified life. But here is the thing. The concept of privacy as we understand it is historically very recent. For most of human history, across most of the world, people slept communally. They ate communally. They worked in the same spaces where they rested. The idea that every individual should have their own room, their own bed, their own carefully controlled environment. That idea is a product of the last 200 years at most, and in practical terms, it has only been widely accessible in the last 70 or 80. The people in this longhouse did not feel deprived of privacy because they had never had it and had no concept that it was something to want. What they had instead was something different, something that we, with all our private bedrooms and noise-cancelling headphones and carefully curated personal spaces, have largely traded away. They had constant, inescapable human presence. They were never alone. Not when they slept, not when they worked, not when they were sick or afraid or grieving. There was always someone within arm's reach, always a voice in the darkness, always the warmth of another body nearby. I am not romanticizing this. I am genuinely not. There were nights, certainly, when the crying of a baby or the snoring of a grandfather or the restless shifting of a thrall on the platform across the aisle was maddening. There were tensions, conflicts, the particular kind of friction that comes from people who cannot get away from each other. The sagas are full of household disputes that escalated precisely because there was no space to cool down, no room to retreat to. But there was also something in that arrangement, something in the simple fact of being surrounded by living, breathing people through the long, dark night that provided a kind of security that solitude never can. I think about that sometimes, lying in my own quiet room, in my own temperature-controlled house, with the door closed and the world shut out. I think about what it would feel like to fall asleep hearing your mother's breathing, your father's slow, heavy rhythm, the small sounds your sisters made in their sleep. I think about waking in the night to the glow of the fire and knowing, without opening your eyes, that everyone you loved was right there. And I wonder if something we call progress might also be, in some small and honest way, a kind of loss. There is one part of this sleeping arrangement that I need to tell you about, and I want to be careful because it complicates the warmth of everything I've just described. Not everyone in this longhouse was free. Not everyone was a member of the family, and not everyone had chosen to be here. The Thralls. Viking Age Scandinavia, like most complex societies in the ancient and medieval world, practiced slavery. The Norse word for an enslaved person was thrall, a word that has entered English in the expression enthrall too, meaning completely under someone's power. And the thralls in a Norse longhouse occupied a position that was, by any honest reckoning, at the very bottom of the social order. Thralls became thralls in several ways. Some were born into slavery, the children of enslaved mothers automatically inheriting their mother's status regardless of who the father was. Some were captured in raids, taken from their homes in Ireland, England, Scotland, or other parts of Europe, and brought back to Scandinavia to work. Some were people who had fallen into debt or who had been convicted of certain crimes and who had been sentenced to unfreedom as a consequence. And some were purchased at the slave markets that operated in major Norse trading centres like Hedeby, Birka, and Dublin. The lives of thralls varied considerably, depending on the household they belonged to. In the best cases, a thrall might be treated as a valued member of the household, fed the same food, given reasonable tasks, and eventually freed, either through purchase of their own freedom or through the generosity of their owner. Manumission, the formal freeing of a slave, was a recognised legal act in Norse society, and freed thralls could eventually become full members of the community, though the stigma of former enslavement might cling to their family for generations. In the worst cases, the life of a thrall was one of grinding, unrelenting labour with little hope of improvement. The Rigsthula, a Norse poem that describes the origin of the three social classes, portrays the thrall class in terms that are deliberately unflattering, describing them as dark-skinned, stooped, with calloused hands and rough faces, performing the heaviest and most unpleasant work, carrying loads, herding pigs, spreading dung on the fields. The poem is not a neutral description. It is justification, an attempt to naturalize a social order that required some people to do the work that other people did not want to do. In the Longhouse at night, the thralls slept at the edges, near the doors where the drafts were worst, near the animals, in the section of the building that was coldest and least comfortable. They shared the same room and the same fire, but they did not share the same status, and the arrangement of sleeping bodies on those platforms was a nightly reminder of that fact. I find this difficult to sit with, and I think it is important not to look away from it. The same people who built those extraordinary ships, who wove those beautiful textiles, who told those magnificent stories, who created a legal system of remarkable sophistication, also owned other human beings. They were capable of both generosity and cruelty, both creativity and exploitation. And the Longhouse, that intimate, shared, inescapable space, contained both of those realities simultaneously. History is like that. It does not sort itself neatly into categories of good and bad, admirable and shameful. It presents you with people who are all of those things at once, and it asks you to hold the complexity without simplifying it. I think the willingness to do that, to hold the beauty and the brutality together without flinching, is part of what it means to take history seriously. And tonight, lying here in this longhouse, listening to every person in the room breathing in the darkness, some free and some not, I think it is worth taking seriously. But the morning is here now, or what passes for morning, and the first person to move, the first body to push back the heavy furs and swing their legs over the edge of the sleeping platform and place their feet on the cold earth floor of the longhouse was almost always the same person. The woman of the house. She had a title in Old Norse, Husfreyja. It means, roughly, the lady of the house. And we will talk about her much more deeply later in this story because her role was far more complex and far more powerful than the word housewife begins to suggest. But for now, in this early grey moment, she is the first one up, and the first thing she does, before anything else, before breakfast, before the children, before the animals, is check the fire. Which brings us to the single most important object in the entire Viking world. Not a sword, not a ship, not a rune stone or a golden arm ring, a fire. a long, low, perpetual fire that burned in the centre of the Longhouse, and that, without exaggeration, made every other part of this life possible. That is exactly where we're going next. If you have been following along with me for a while, you already know how I feel about the fire at the centre of a historical home. It is never just a fire. It is never just heat and light and a way to cook your dinner. In every era I have studied, in every kind of dwelling, from the colonial American farmhouse to the medieval English cottage, the fire is the heart of the building. Not metaphorically, literally. Everything else arranges itself around it. The furniture, the daily routine, the social structure of the family, the rhythm of sleeping and waking, all of it orbits the fire the way planets orbit a star. But the fire in a Viking longhouse was different from any of those. Different in scale, different in function, different in the sheer centrality of its presence. And once you understand how it worked, how it was built and maintained and managed through every hour of every day, you will understand something essential about these people and the world they made for themselves inside those turf walls. Let me describe it for you. The hearth in a typical longhouse was not a fireplace. There was no chimney, no bricks around, no mantel, no neat stone frame. The hearth was an open trench, a long, shallow, stone-lined depression running down the centre of the building, sometimes for half the length of the hall, sometimes for nearly the entire length. In a modest farmhouse of perhaps 20 metres, the hearth might stretch for 8 or 10 metres. In a chieftain's hall it could run for 20 metres or more. A continuous line of fire, stone-bordered and fed with wood, burning low through the night and built up during the day, the spine of the entire building. The stones lining the hearth were usually flat, heavy, and carefully selected. In Iceland and parts of Norway, soapstone was the preferred material. Soapstone has a remarkable property that made it invaluable in a world without metal cookware. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly, which means a soapstone-lined hearth acted as a kind of thermal battery, storing warmth from the fire and radiating it outward for hours after the flames had died down. A well-maintained hearth lined with good soapstone could keep the centre of the longhouse tolerably warm through the coldest hours of the night, even as the fire itself was allowed to burn down to embers, and this is where the Husfreyja comes in. Because managing that fire, keeping it alive through the night, rebuilding it each morning, controlling its intensity for different tasks throughout the day, was one of the most important and most continuously demanding responsibilities of the woman who ran the household. The fire in a Viking longhouse was never allowed to go out entirely, not if it could possibly be helped, and the reasons were the same as in every pre-match, pre-lighter, pre-modern convenience era of human history. Starting a fire from nothing was hard. Not impossible, but hard, and time-consuming, and dependent on having the right materials in the right condition at the right moment. The Vikings started fire using a method that will sound familiar if you have spent time with other eras of history, but that had its own particular Norse refinements. The basic toolkit was a fire steel, a C-shaped piece of forged iron and a piece of flint. You struck the flint against the steel, directing the resulting sparks into a bundle of prepared tinder. The tinder, and this is the part that mattered most, had to be absolutely dry. Birch bark was the preferred material across much of Scandinavia because it contains natural oils that make it catch a spark more readily than almost any other organic material. Dried grass, shredded moss, and char cloth fabric that had been previously partially burned to make it more receptive to sparks were also used. There is an archaeological detail here that I find quietly wonderful. At several Viking Age sites, excavators have found small pouches or containers, sometimes made from leather, sometimes from antler, that were clearly designed to hold fire-starting materials. These pouches contained the fire steel, the flint, and a carefully wrapped bundle of tinder, kept dry and protected, often carried on the person. These were not casual objects, they were survival equipment. In a world where the difference between a fire and no fire could be the difference between life and death, the tools for making fire were treated with a seriousness that we, with our disposable lighters and our central heating, have entirely lost. But most mornings, if the fire had been properly banked the night before, the Husfreyja did not need to start from scratch. She needed to resurrect. The process was similar to what colonial American women would do centuries later, because the physics of fire do not change across cultures. The embers from the previous night's fire had been gathered into a central pile and covered with ash, just as they would be in any hearth-centered home. The ash insulated the coals, slowing their combustion almost to nothing while preserving a core of living heat. In the grey light of morning, the Husfreyja knelt beside the hearth. She scraped back the ash carefully. She found the embers, orange-red beneath their grey blanket, still alive. She added small pieces of dry kindling, birch bark first, then thin splints of resinous pine. She blew on them gently, steadily, not the frantic huffing of someone in a hurry, but the measured, practiced breath of someone who had done this 1,000 times and knew exactly how much air the ember needed. A wisp of smoke, a tiny tongue of flame, and then, gradually the fire returning, the light returning, the warmth returning. And in that moment I think the day truly began. Not when the sun rose, because in a Norwegian winter the sun might not rise at all, but when the fire came back. That was morning. Now, let me tell you about what was cooked on that fire, because the cooking technology of a Viking Longhouse is one of those subjects that sounds simple and turns out to be remarkably sophisticated. The primary cooking vessel in a Norse household was the iron cauldron. These were large, round-bottomed pots, sometimes quite heavy, suspended over the fire by a chain or hung from a tripod of iron or wood. The chain arrangement is important because it allowed the cook to raise or lower the pot, controlling the heat not by adjusting the fire, which was not always practical, but by adjusting the distance between the pot and the flames. Higher meant gentler heat, a slow simmer. Lower meant more intense heat, a rolling boil. It was a vertical thermostat, crude but effective. Iron cauldrons were valuable objects. The amount of iron required to forge one was considerable, and iron in Viking Age Scandinavia, while not rare, was not cheap. A household that owned a good iron cauldron treated it with care. It was repaired when it cracked, patched with iron rivets when it wore thin, and passed down through generations. Some cauldrons recovered from archaeological sites show evidence of multiple repairs over decades of use. These were not disposable items, they were investments. But iron was not the only material used for cooking. Soapstone, that same wonderful heat-absorbing stone used to line the hearth, was also carved into cooking vessels, shallow bowls and pots that could be placed directly in the embers. Soapstone pots heated evenly and held their temperature beautifully, making them ideal for slow cooking, for porridge, for the kind of patient, low-heat preparation that turned tough meat and dried fish into something genuinely edible. And then there was the simplest cooking technology of all, one that requires no pot and no vessel of any kind. The hot stone. This technique, which the Norse used extensively, and which appears across cultures worldwide in eras before metal cookware was widely available, works like this. You heat stones in the fire until they are extremely hot. Then, using tongs or sticks, you transfer the stones into a container of liquid, a wooden trough, a leather bag, even a hole dug in the ground and lined with an animal skin. The hot stones transfer their heat to the liquid, bringing it to a boil without the container ever touching the fire directly. This meant you could boil water, cook stew, or prepare broth in a wooden bucket, something you obviously cannot place over an open flame. Archaeologists working at Viking Age sites have found pits filled with fire-cracked stones, the distinctive rounded fractured stones that result from being heated and then plunged into cold water repeatedly. These cooking pits are so common at Norse sites that they have become one of the diagnostic features used to identify Viking settlements. Wherever you find a longhouse, you find fire-cracked stones. The two go together like a kitchen and a stove. I want to sit with this for a moment because I think there is something genuinely remarkable about it. We're talking about a people who could boil water in a leather bag. Not because they did not know about metal, they were some of the most skilled ironworkers in early medieval Europe, but because they understood that different materials served different purposes and that the best technology is not always the most advanced. It is the most appropriate. A leather bag was lighter than an iron pot. It was easier to carry on a journey. It could be folded and stored, and if you had hot stones and a fire, it worked perfectly. There is a lesson in that, I think. A quiet one. About the difference between sophistication and complexity. The Viking approach to cooking was extraordinarily sophisticated. It was not particularly complex. And those two things, sophistication and complexity, are not the same thing at all. The fire served purposes beyond cooking that I want to mention briefly, because they are easy to overlook, but they shape the daily rhythm of the longhouse in important ways. The fire was the primary source of light. In a building with no windows or windows so small they barely qualified, the hearth fire was how you saw. The amber glow it cast was warm but limited, brightest along the central aisle and fading to near darkness at the edges of the sleeping platforms. Any task that required good visibility, sewing, carving, tool repair, was done close to the fire, which meant the central aisle of the longhouse was not just a corridor, it was a workspace, a communal workshop lit by the same flames that cooked the food and heated the room. The fire was also, in a very real sense, the clock. Not a precise clock, not one that told you the hour in any way we would recognize, but the fire's cycle, its building up in the morning, its steady burning through the day, its banking at night, created a rhythm that the household followed instinctively. The state of the fire told you where you were in the day. A freshly built fire meant morning. A high, steady fire meant the main meal was being prepared. A low, glowing bed of embers meant the evening was winding down. The fire did not just serve the household, it paced it. And here is one more thing about the fire that I find myself thinking about whenever I study this period. The fire was communal. There was one fire, one hearth. Everyone gathered around it. Everyone shared its warmth. The chieftain and the thrall sat on opposite sides of the same flames. The fire did not discriminate. It warmed whoever was close to it, and it left whoever was far from it in the cold. In a society that was rigidly hierarchical, where your status determined your sleeping position and your seat at the table, and whether you ate first or last, the fire was the one thing that was, in a purely physical sense, egalitarian. Its heat reached everyone. I do not know if the people sitting around that hearth thought about it in those terms. Probably not. But I think about it, and I think there is something worth noticing in the fact that the most essential thing in the Longhouse, the thing without which nothing else was possible, was also the thing that belonged to no one and served everyone. The fire is going now. The smoke is rising into the rafters. The Longhouse is beginning to stir, bodies shifting under furs, voices murmuring, the first movements of a household coming slowly, reluctantly awake. And the question that settles over everything, the question that shapes the entire first hour of the day, is a simple one. What is there to eat? That question, in a Viking household in the year 870, had an answer that will surprise you in almost every particular. Because the food that these people ate, how they prepared it, how they stored it, what it tasted like, and what it tells us about the world they lived in, is a story all its own. And it starts with something that you can still buy in a grocery store today, though you probably walk right past it without a second thought. Stay with me. The morning meal in a Viking household was not what you are picturing. I can say that with some confidence because what most people picture when they think about Vikings eating involves a long table piled with roasted meat, enormous tankards of mead, a whole roasted pig perhaps, everyone tearing into food with their hands while someone in a horned helmet laughs in the background. That image comes from films, from television, from centuries of romanticized mythology, and it is wrong in almost every detail. Let us start with what was actually on the table, or rather, what was not on the table, because for the morning meal there often was no table. The first meal of the day in a Norse household was called Dagverdr, which translates roughly to day meal. It was eaten sometime in the mid-morning, not at dawn, not immediately upon waking, but after the first tasks of the day had been completed. The animals had been tended, the fire rebuilt, the water drawn. Only then did the household gather to eat, and what they ate most mornings, most of the year, was some version of the same thing. Porridge, grain porridge, barley or oat, depending on what grew in the region, boiled in water or milk into a thick, warm, filling mush that stuck to your ribs and gave you the energy to work through a physical day. In Iceland, where barley was the only grain that would reliably grow in the short, cool growing season, barley porridge was the absolute staple, the foundation of the diet, the thing you could count on when nothing else was certain. This porridge was not the refined, sweetened, Instagram-worthy oatmeal that fills modern breakfast bowls. It was coarse. The grain was often only partially ground, leaving bits of hull and husk in the mixture. It was thick, sometimes thick enough that a spoon would stand up in it. And it was seasoned, if it was seasoned at all, with whatever was available. A little salt, perhaps, a lump of butter, if the cows had been giving well. In summer, when the brief northern growing season produced a sudden abundance of wild berries, cloudberries, bilberries, lingonberries, a handful of those might be stirred in. But for most of the year, the porridge was what it was, grain and liquid and heat. And here is the thing I want you to understand about that porridge, because it tells you something essential about this life. Nobody complained about it. Not because they were stoic or disciplined, or because their culture somehow suppressed the desire for variety. They didn't complain because this was breakfast. This was what breakfast was. The concept of breakfast as a meal that should be interesting, that should offer choices, that should be an experience, is so modern that it would have been completely unintelligible to a person living in the 9th century. You ate porridge because porridge was what there was in the morning, and then you went to work. Now, alongside the porridge, or sometimes instead of it, the morning meal might include bread. And this is where things get interesting, because Viking bread was nothing like the bread you're imagining. The most common bread in Viking Age Scandinavia was flatbread, thin rounds of barley or rye flour mixed with water and baked on a flat stone or an iron griddle placed directly over the fire. These were not soft, they were not fluffy. They did not rise because the yeast-based leavening that produces the kind of bread we buy in plastic bags at the supermarket was not widely used in everyday Norse baking. What you got was something dense and slightly chewy, with a nutty, slightly bitter flavour from the coarsely ground grain and a faint smokiness from the hearth. Archaeologists have found actual fragments of Viking bread preserved in waterlogged conditions at several Norse sites, and analysis of these fragments has revealed something fascinating. The grain was often ground on hand-operated rotary querns, small millstones turned by hand, and the grinding process frequently introduced tiny fragments of stone into the flour. These stone fragments, ground fine but not invisible, ended up in the bread. And over a lifetime of eating bread made this way, they wore down the teeth of the people who ate it. Dental analysis of Viking Age skeletal remains consistently shows heavy tooth wear, the enamel ground away by years of chewing bread that contained microscopic particles of stone. That detail always stays with me. The bread wore their teeth down, not because the food was bad, not because they were doing something wrong, but because the technology they had for grinding grain, the best technology available to them, left its mark on their bodies. They carried the cost of their daily bread in their mouths for the rest of their lives. There was another food on the morning table that you can still find in almost any grocery store today, though it has been rebranded and repositioned so thoroughly that most people have no idea where it came from. Skyr. If you have seen Skyr in the dairy aisle, you probably noticed it sitting next to the yogurt, marketed as an Icelandic yogurt or a high-protein dairy product. And technically, that is true. Skyr is a cultured dairy product, thick and tangy, with a consistency somewhere between yogurt and soft cheese. But Skyr is not yogurt. It is its own thing, and it has been its own thing for over 1,000 years. The Norse made Skyr by warming milk, adding a small amount of Skyr from the previous batch as a starter culture, and then letting the mixture ferment. The result was strained through cloth to remove the whey, leaving behind a thick, slightly sour, intensely protein-rich food that could be eaten fresh or stored for weeks. In Iceland, where dairy farming was the backbone of the agricultural economy, and where preservation of food through the long winter was a matter of survival, Skyr was one of the most important foods in the diet. It was eaten with cream when cream was available. It was eaten with wild berries in the short summer. It was eaten plain and unsweetened and cold when nothing else was offered, and it kept. In a world without refrigeration, where the primary methods of food preservation were drying, smoking, salting, fermenting, and burying in the cold ground, a food that naturally preserved itself through controlled fermentation was worth its weight in anything you care to name. The fact that you can buy Skyr in a supermarket in the 21st century, 1,000 years after a Norse woman on an Icelandic farm first figured out how to make it, strikes me as one of those quiet threads of continuity that make history feel less like a distant subject and more like something you are still living inside. The recipe has barely changed. The process is essentially the same. The only difference is the packaging. The morning meal also included, when it was available, dried fish, cod primarily. The waters off the coasts of Norway and Iceland were extraordinarily rich in cod, and the Norse had developed sophisticated techniques for preserving it. The most common method was wind drying, hanging split fish on wooden racks in the cold, dry wind and letting nature do the work of preservation. The result, called stockfish, was a rigid, board-like slab of concentrated protein that could be stored for years without spoiling and rehydrated by soaking in water before cooking. Stockfish was not just food, it was currency, it was trade goods. It was the foundation of an export economy that connected the Norse world to markets across Europe and beyond. The waters off the Lofoten Islands in northern Norway produced stockfish of such consistently high quality that it became one of the most traded commodities in the medieval European economy. 1,000 years later, stockfish from those same waters is still exported to markets in Italy, West Africa, and the Caribbean. For a morning meal in a coastal household, a piece of dried fish might be pounded with a stone to soften it, then torn into strips and eaten alongside the porridge and the flatbread. It was salty and chewy and intensely flavoured, the kind of food that requires work from your jaw and rewards you with a deep, sustained energy that kept your body going through hours of physical labour. And finally, to wash it all down, there was ale. Not the craft ale of a modern brewery, not something you would recognise if you poured it into a glass. Viking ale was a thick, cloudy, only partially fermented brew made from barley, sometimes flavoured with bog myrtle or yarrow or other wild herbs, because hops, the ingredient that gives modern beer its characteristic bitterness and preservative quality, did not become widely used in Scandinavian brewing until the later medieval period. This ale was low in alcohol, perhaps 2 or 3%, closer to what medieval English sources would call small beer. It was brewed frequently, often weekly, because without the preservative effect of hops, it did not keep well. It had to be made and consumed within days. The brewing was the woman's responsibility, like almost everything else that happened inside the Longhouse, and it required skill, timing, and a good understanding of the fermentation process, knowledge passed from mother to daughter in a chain of unwritten expertise that stretched back centuries. The ale was drunk because it was safe. Just as in colonial America, just as in medieval England, the fermentation process killed the microorganisms that could make untreated water dangerous. The Norse drank ale the way we drink water, with meals, between meals, before work, after work. It was not recreation, it was hydration. Now, I want to ask you something, and I mean it genuinely. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine that meal. Not the feast, not the celebration. The ordinary Tuesday morning, the porridge, thick and warm, the flatbread, dense and slightly gritty. A piece of dried fish, a bowl of Skyr, cool and sour, a cup of cloudy ale, the fire cracking in the hearth, the smoke drifting. The quiet, purposeful sounds of a household eating before the work of the day begins. There is nothing glamorous about it, nothing dramatic, nothing that would make a good scene in a Viking movie. And yet I find it deeply satisfying to picture. Not because the food sounds appealing by modern standards, though some of it genuinely does, but because of what the meal represents. Sufficiency, not abundance, not luxury, just enough. Enough protein to power a body through a day of heavy physical work. Enough carbohydrate to sustain endurance. Enough fat to maintain warmth in a cold climate. Every element of that breakfast was calibrated, not by a nutritionist, but by centuries of lived experience, to keep a human being functional in one of the most demanding environments on Earth. There is wisdom in that. Not the kind you read in a book, the kind that accumulates slowly, generation after generation, through the quiet process of figuring out what works and what does not. But before we leave the subject of food entirely, I want to take you deeper into something that shaped this diet in ways that most people never consider. Seasonality. Because the food available to a Viking household did not remain constant throughout the year, it shifted dramatically, and the rhythm of those shifts governed the entire domestic calendar. In the brief Scandinavian summer, roughly from late May to early September depending on the latitude, the diet expanded in ways that must have felt like a kind of relief after the long winter of stored provisions. Fresh milk was available from the cows and goats. Wild berries ripened in the meadows and along the forest edges, cloudberries in the bogs, bilberries in the uplands, lingonberries that clung to low bushes and turned the hillsides red in August. Seabird eggs could be gathered from the coastal cliffs, a dangerous task that involved climbing sheer rock faces with nothing but bare hands and a bag, but one that yielded large, rich, protein-dense eggs that were prized as a seasonal delicacy. Fresh fish, caught daily from the fjords and rivers, appeared on the table in quantities that the winter diet could not match. And there was fresh meat, though less frequently than you might imagine. The Norse did not slaughter their livestock casually during the summer. Every animal alive in June was an animal that had survived the winter, and its continued life represented breeding stock, milk production, wool, and the promise of future calves and lambs. Slaughtering a healthy animal in summer was an economic decision that had to be weighed carefully. The exception was hunting. Wild game, deer, elk, hare, and in some regions reindeer, supplemented the diet when it could be taken, but hunting was never the primary food source for a settled farming community. It was a bonus, not a foundation. The real work of summer, the work that determined whether the household would eat well or go hungry through the coming winter, was preservation. And the techniques the Norse used to preserve food reveal a depth of practical knowledge that I find genuinely impressive. Drying was the most common method. Fish, as I mentioned, was split and hung on wooden racks in the cold, dry wind, a technique that worked best in the northern regions where the combination of a low humidity and steady breezes created ideal conditions. Meat was dried in similar fashion, cut into thin strips and hung over racks or spread on flat stones in the sun. The resulting dried meat, hard and chewy and intensely concentrated, could be stored for months and reconstituted by soaking in water or adding to a stew. Smoking was used as well, and here the longhouse itself became part of the preservation infrastructure. Meat and fish hung from the rafters in the smoky upper reaches of the building, cured slowly over weeks, absorbing the preservative compounds in the wood smoke that inhibited bacterial growth. The same smoke that irritated your lungs and stung your eyes was, simultaneously, turning your food supply into something that could survive the winter. Salting was practiced where salt was available, though salt was not equally accessible across the Norse world. Coastal communities could produce salt by evaporating seawater, a labour-intensive process that required large amounts of fuel and produced relatively modest quantities. Inland communities often had to trade for salt, making it a commodity of considerable value. When salt was available, it was used to cure meat and fish in much the same way that colonial Americans would use it centuries later, rubbing the salt into the flesh and packing it in barrels. Fermentation, which we have already touched on with Skyr and ale, was another preservation strategy, and the Norse applied it more broadly than just dairy and grain. There is evidence, both archaeological and textual, that the Norse fermented fish in a way that would produce something similar to the Scandinavian delicacies that survive to this day, the kinds of strong-smelling, intensely flavoured preserved fish that modern Scandinavians either love passionately or cannot stand to be in the same room with. The tradition of fermented shark in Iceland, hakal, which involves burying shark meat underground for several months and then hanging it to dry, is believed to have roots that stretch back to the Viking Age or earlier. And then there was butter. Butter, when properly made and stored, could last for an astonishingly long time. The Norse packed butter into wooden containers, sometimes into barrels, and stored it in cool places, in pits dug into the ground, in stone-lined chambers beneath the floor of the Longhouse. In Ireland and Scotland, where the Norse settled in significant numbers, a tradition developed of burying butter in bogs, where the cool, acidic, oxygen-poor conditions preserved it almost indefinitely. Archaeologists have found butter in Irish bogs that is hundreds of years old, and, while you would not want to spread it on toast, is still recognisably butter. The bog butter tradition may have begun as a preservation technique and evolved into something more complex, possibly ritualistic over time. The autumn was the season of decision. As the days shortened and the first frosts arrived, the farmer had to calculate how many animals he could feed through the winter based on the size of the hay harvest. The animals he could not feed had to be slaughtered. This was not a celebration, though it was sometimes accompanied by feasting. It was a pragmatic, often painful process of reducing the herd to a number that the stored hay could support. The meat from the autumn slaughter was the bulk of the household's winter protein supply, and it was preserved by every method available: dried, smoked, salted, packed in whey, hung in the rafters. And it is here, in the autumn, that mead enters the picture. Mead, the honey wine that has become almost synonymous with the Vikings in popular culture, was not an everyday drink. It was special. It was expensive. Honey, the only sweetener available in pre-sugar Scandinavia, was difficult to produce in quantity, and the bees that produced it were vulnerable to the same harsh climate that challenged everything else. A household that had enough honey to brew mead was a household of means. Mead was served at feasts. It was served at weddings. The Old Norse word for wedding feast, brúllaup, is related to the word for bride ale, and the tradition of the honeymoon may derive from the Norse custom of providing a newly married couple with enough mead to last a month, a moon's worth of honey wine, to celebrate their union and, it was hoped, to encourage fertility. In the great halls of the chieftains, mead was poured by the lady of the house herself, who carried the cup from guest to guest in a specific order, determined by rank and honour. The act of pouring mead was not a servant's task. It was a ceremonial role, and the woman who performed it was making visible the social hierarchy of the hall with every cup she offered. Who received mead first, who received the finest cup, who was passed over or served last. These were statements of power and status that everyone in the room understood. I find that detail fascinating. That the simple act of pouring a drink could carry that much weight. That the cup in your hand could tell you exactly where you stood in the world. We think we have left those kinds of rituals behind, but I am not sure we have. The modern dinner party, the business lunch, the reserved table at the restaurant, these are all descendants, I think, of the same instinct. The instinct to use food and drink as a language of belonging. The meal is finished. The bowls are scraped clean. The ale cup is drained. Outside, the thin winter light is as strong as it is going to get today. A pale grey wash that makes the snow glow faintly and turns the sky into something that is not quite day and not quite night, but something in between that has its own particular beauty. And now the Longhouse divides. Because the work that fills the daylight hours, the tasks that keep this household alive through the winter and prepare it for the spring, splits cleanly, precisely, and with very little overlap between the world of the women and the world of the men. And the women's world, I have to tell you, is the one that surprised me more. Here is something that I find genuinely important to say before we go any further, and I want to be careful about how I say it because it is easy to get wrong. The popular image of Viking women is, in many ways, a correction of an earlier, even more wrong image. For a long time, the women of the Viking Age were essentially invisible in popular culture. The stories were about the men, the raids, the ships, the battles, the discoveries. Women appeared when they appeared at all as wives waiting at home, as prizes to be won, as background figures in a saga that belonged to someone else. In recent decades, there has been a significant and largely welcome effort to correct this. We now talk about Viking women as strong, independent, powerful figures, and that is closer to the truth, but it is still not quite the truth. Because the real story is more interesting, more complicated, and frankly more impressive than either of those simplified versions. The woman who ran a Viking household was not powerful in the way a modern person uses that word. She did not hold political office. She did not vote. She did not own property in her own right in most Norse legal traditions, though her rights were considerably greater than those of women in many contemporary European societies. What she held was something different. She held the keys, literally. The keys to the storeroom, the pantry, the grain supply, the dried meat, the preserved fish, the ale. In Norse culture, the household keys were not a mundane domestic accessory. They were a symbol of authority so potent that they were often worn visibly, hung from a brooch at the woman's chest, displayed for everyone to see. When a woman married and took control of a household, she received the keys. When she died or was divorced, the keys passed to the next woman in line. Archaeologists have found elaborate keys and key rings in women's graves across the Viking world, buried with them as markers of status and identity, just as men were buried with their swords and shields. The Husfreyja, the lady of the house, controlled the food supply. In a world where food was the most fundamental form of wealth, where the difference between a well-provisioned household and a starving one could be measured in the number of barrels of dried fish and the depth of the grain stores, controlling the food supply was not a consolation prize for being excluded from the adventures. It was the thing that made the adventures possible. When the men left on trading voyages or raiding expeditions or seasonal fishing trips, and they did, often for months at a time, the woman ran everything. The farm, the livestock, the workers, the thralls, the children, the daily and seasonal operations of an enterprise that was, in every meaningful sense, a small business. She made the decisions, she managed the resources, she allocated the labour, she calculated how much food had to last through the winter and made it last. And if she did this well, the household thrived. And if she did it badly, the household could fail. There was no safety net, no emergency assistance, no neighbour obligated to help beyond the bonds of mutual self-interest. The woman either ran her household competently or she did not, and the consequences were immediate and unforgiving. Now, let me take you into the specific work of a day, because this is where the abstract concept of household management becomes something you can feel in your bones. The loom. We need to talk about the loom. Textile production in the Viking Age was not a hobby. It was not a craft practiced in leisure hours. It was an industrial operation carried out primarily by women that consumed more labour hours than almost any other activity in the Norse household, and the scale of what was required will genuinely stagger you when you hear the numbers. The Vikings used a type of loom called the Warp-Weighted Loom, one of the oldest loom designs in human history, dating back at least 5,000 years. It was a simple, elegant and labour-intensive device. 2 upright wooden beams supported a horizontal bar from which the warp threads, the vertical threads that form the skeleton of the fabric, hung downward. At the bottom of each warp thread, a weight, usually made from stone or fired clay, kept the thread taut. The weaver stood at the loom and passed the weft threads, the horizontal threads, back and forth through the warp, building the fabric from the top down. The process was slow. Even an experienced weaver working steadily through the daylight hours might produce only a few centimetres of finished cloth per day. And the amount of cloth a household needed was enormous. Everyone needed clothing, tunics, trousers, cloaks, undergarments. Blankets were woven. Sails were woven. And it is the sails that reveal the true scale of what was being asked of these women. A single sail for a Viking longship, the kind of vessel that carried raiders and traders across the North Sea and the Atlantic, required approximately 90 square metres of woven wool. 90 square metres. That is roughly the floor area of a modern 3-bedroom apartment. And that sail was not woven from purchased fabric. It was woven at home, on a warp-weighted loom, by the women of the household, from wool that they had sheared from their own sheep, cleaned, carded, and spun into thread by hand. Researchers who have attempted to reconstruct the labour involved in producing a single Viking sail have estimated that it required approximately 2 full years of work. Not 2 years of occasional weaving, 2 years of someone working at the loom for hours every day. And that was just the weaving. The preparation of the wool, the shearing, the washing, the combing to align the fibres, the spinning on a hand spindle that added thousands of additional labour hours. I want to sit with that number for a moment because I think it is one of those details that fundamentally changes how you understand a society. 2 years of labour for one sail, and every longship needed a sail, and every community that sent ships to sea needed women who could produce them. When we talk about the Viking Age, we talk about ships. The longship is the defining artifact of the era, the thing that made everything else possible, the raids, the trade routes, the colonization of Iceland and Greenland and briefly North America. But every one of those ships sailed on cloth that was woven by women who never left the Longhouse. The entire expansion of the Norse world, every voyage, every discovery, every legendary journey, was built on a foundation of textile labour that was almost entirely female. I do not know why that gets to me, but it does every time. The weaving was only part of it. Before the wool could be woven, it had to be spun, and spinning was the most constant, most portable, and most universally practiced of all the textile arts. Women spun everywhere and at all times. They spun while tending the fire. They spun while watching the children. They spun while walking between buildings on the farmstead. The tool they used was the drop spindle, a simple weighted stick that was suspended from the thread as it was spun, the weight of the spindle keeping the thread taut, while the spinner's fingers twisted the raw wool into yarn. Drop spindles have been found at virtually every Viking Age site ever excavated. They are among the most common artifacts recovered, rivaled only by combs in their sheer ubiquity. And the reason they are so common is simple. Spinning was a task that was never truly finished. There was always more wool to spin, always more thread to produce, always another garment to weave, another sail to prepare for, another winter to clothe a household against. Let me tell you about one more aspect of the women's daily work, because it connects to the morning meal we talked about earlier, and because I find it quietly magnificent. Dairy work. The processing of milk into butter, cheese, and skyr was a daily task during the milking season, and it required the same kind of patient, practiced, cumulative skill as the weaving. You milked the cows and the goats and sometimes the sheep in the early morning. You carried the milk inside. You set some aside for drinking, warm and fresh. You poured the rest into shallow wooden vessels and left it to separate. The cream rising slowly to the surface. You skimmed the cream. You churned the butter. You made the Skyr, adding the starter culture from the previous batch, warming the milk, letting the fermentation do its slow, invisible work. You pressed the cheese. Every one of these processes required judgment, timing, and experience. If you churned too long, the butter turned grainy. If you did not churn long enough, the buttermilk did not separate properly. If the temperature was wrong when you added the Skyr starter, the fermentation would fail and you would lose the milk. And in a household where dairy products were a primary source of calories and a critical winter food supply, losing a batch of Skyr or a churning of butter was not an inconvenience. It was a small catastrophe. These women were chemists, in the oldest and most literal sense of the word. They controlled chemical processes that they could not see, that happened on a microbial level they could not have imagined, using techniques refined by generations of observation and passed down through demonstration and practice. They did not know the word fermentation. They did not know what bacteria were. They did not need to. They knew what worked. They knew the feel of the milk at the right temperature, the smell of the skyr when it was ready, the sound of the butter as it began to come together in the churn. Their knowledge was in their hands and their senses, and it was as precise and as reliable as any laboratory protocol. And they did all of this while watching children, tending the fire, preparing meals, and managing a household of 10 or 15 or 20 people, in a single dark room that smelled of smoke and animals and wool grease. I have said this before about other eras and other women, and I will say it again because it remains true. When I read accounts of what these women managed day after day, year after year, I feel something close to awe. Not the performative kind, the real kind. The kind that sits quietly in your chest and rearranges your sense of what competence actually looks like. But there is one more dimension of the women's work that I want to explore before we step outside, because it connects the practical and the social in a way that I find genuinely beautiful. The clothing itself, the garments that a Norse household wore, were not simple. They were not crude wrappings or shapeless tunics thrown together from whatever fabric was available. Norse clothing, as reconstructed from archaeological finds, textile fragments, and the descriptions in the sagas, was carefully constructed, deliberately designed, and in many cases quite beautiful. A woman's typical outfit consisted of a long linen or woolen underdress, reaching to the ankles, over which was worn a woolen apron dress, a garment held up by a pair of large brooches at the shoulders, the famous oval brooches that are among the most recognizable artifacts of the Viking Age. These brooches were not just functional, they were decorative, often elaborately cast in bronze, gilded and ornamented with animal patterns in the distinctive Norse art style. Between the brooches a string of beads might be strung, glass and amber and sometimes semi-precious stones, creating a cascade of colour across the chest. A man wore a long wool tunic reaching to mid-thigh or the knee, belted at the waist over woolen trousers that might be either loose or fitted. A cloak, fastened at the shoulder with a single brooch or pin, completed the outfit. In cold weather, fur-lined cloaks and hats of animal skin provided additional warmth. The colours of these garments were not the dull, undyed brown and grey that we tend to imagine when we think of the medieval world. The Norse dyed their fabrics, and they dyed them in colours that range from subtle to vivid, Blue, obtained from the woad plant, was widely used and highly valued. Red came from madder root, a plant cultivated specifically for its dye potential. Yellow was produced from several sources, including weld and onion skins. Green could be achieved by over-dyeing blue fabric with yellow. Purple, the most expensive and prestigious colour in the ancient and medieval world, was occasionally achieved through imported dyes or through complex combinations of locally available materials. The dye process itself was another domain of the women's knowledge. Different mordants, the chemical compounds used to fix dyes permanently in the fibre, produced different results with the same dye plant. Alum, iron, copper, urine. These were all used as mordants, and knowing which combination of dye and mordant would produce a stable, beautiful colour on a particular type of wool was knowledge that took years to acquire. There is an archaeological textile find from the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, one of the most spectacular Viking Age discoveries ever made, that includes fragments of fabric in multiple colours, including a brilliant blue that has survived over 1,000 years underground. When you see that blue, still vivid after 11 centuries, you understand that these were not people who accepted drabness as the price of their circumstances. They wanted beauty. They achieved beauty. And they achieved it with plant roots and animal urine and the patient, accumulated wisdom of generations of women who knew, by instinct and experience, exactly how long to leave the wool in the dye pot. Clothing in the Norse world was also a powerful social signifier. The quality of your fabric, the fineness of the weave, the richness of the dyes, the elaborateness of the brooches and pins that held it together, all of these communicated your status to everyone who saw you. A woman wearing a fine tablet-woven border on her dress, worked in multiple colours with intricate geometric patterns, was advertising her household's wealth and her own skill with every step she took. A man wearing a cloak fastened with a silver penannular brooch was making a statement about his position in the community that required no words. Tablet weaving, which I should explain briefly because it is extraordinary, was a technique for producing narrow decorative bands used as borders, straps, and embellishments. Small square cards, each with 4 holes through which threads were passed, were arranged in a row and turned in sequence to create complex patterns. The technique allowed for an astonishing degree of precision and variety, and Norse tablet-woven bands recovered from burials and settlement sites include patterns of remarkable sophistication, geometric motifs in 2, 3, or even 4 colours, worked with a precision that suggests long training and genuine artistic sensibility. These bands took time, a great deal of time. A single decorative border for a dress might represent days of focused work, and this was not wasted time, not decorative excess in a world that could not afford it. This was investment. A well-dressed woman represented a well-managed household. A richly decorated garment represented surplus, skill, and the kind of stable prosperity that made a family desirable as allies, as trading partners, as in-laws. The clothing, like the food, like the fire, like the building itself, was part of a system. Every element connected to every other element. The sheep produced the wool. The women spun the wool. They wove the fabric. They dyed it. They cut and sewed the garments. They decorated them with tablet-woven borders and metal brooches, and the finished product, a dressed human body walking across the farmstead, was a visible summary of everything the household was and everything it could do. I find that wholeness genuinely moving. In our world, clothing comes from factories we will never see, made by people we will never see, made by people we will never meet. from materials whose origins we could not trace if our lives depended on it. In the Viking Longhouse, a woman could look at the dress she was wearing and trace every thread back to a specific sheep she had sheared with her own hands. The entire chain, from animal to garment, was visible, tangible, and personal. And there was something in that, a connection between the maker and the made, that I think we have lost so completely that we do not even know what it was. Now, let me take you outside for a while, because while the Husfreyja commanded the interior world of the Longhouse, there was an equally demanding, equally complex world of work happening beyond the turf walls. And this was where the men spent most of their daylight hours. Stepping through the low doorway of the Longhouse and into the winter air was a shock, not because you did not expect it, you expected it every time, but because the difference between inside and outside, between the smoky, animal-warmed, fire-heated interior and the raw, wind-driven cold of a Norwegian winter, was so extreme that no amount of familiarity could entirely prepare you for it. The landscape around the Longhouse deserves a moment of attention because it shaped everything. Everything the people in this house did, everything they ate, everything they built, everything they feared and hoped for, was determined by the land they lived on. Picture it. The Longhouse sits in a cleared area, perhaps a few acres of open ground surrounded by trees, or on the slope above a fjord where the land has been painstakingly cleared of rocks and roots, and made, through generations of labour, into something resembling farmland. The fields, in winter, are white, not the picturesque Christmas card white of a light dusting of snow, but the heavy, deep, immovable white of a landscape that has been buried since November and will not thaw until April or later. The snow is not decoration, it is terrain. Walking through it is work. Every trip to the byre, to the storehouse, to the spring for water is a negotiation with a landscape that is actively trying to slow you down. The trees are conifers, mostly pine and spruce, that keep their dark green needles through the winter, standing against the grey sky like silent, patient sentinels. In some areas, birch trees line the edges of the cleared land. Their bare branches are filigree of white against the darker forest behind them. Birch was one of the most important trees in the Norse world, providing bark for fire starting, for roofing, for the production of tar and pitch, and its sap tapped in spring for a mildly sweet drink that was one of the first signs that the dark season was ending. Beyond the trees, the mountains. In western Norway, where many longhouses were built in the narrow valleys and coastal strips between the mountains and the sea, the mountains were always there, not distant, not background, immediate and enormous, rising sharply from the valley floor to heights that remained snow-covered year-round. The mountains were walls. They defined the limits of your world. They determined how much sunlight reached your farm, how early it disappeared behind the ridge in the afternoon, how late it reappeared in the morning. In the depths of winter, in the deep valleys, the sun might not clear the mountain at all, leaving the valley floor in a perpetual blue-grey twilight even at midday. And then there was the sea. For coastal households, which were the majority in western Norway, the sea was the second boundary. If the mountains were the wall at your back, the sea was the door in front of you. It was dangerous and generous in equal measure. It took lives, regularly and without apology. Fishermen who went out in the morning did not always come back. Storms could appear with terrifying speed, turning a calm fjord into a heaving nightmare of waves and wind that could swamp a small boat in minutes. But the sea also fed you. It connected you to other communities, to trade, to news, to the wider world. The sea was both threat and opportunity, and living beside it required a constant daily calibration of risk that shaped the Norse character in ways that people who have never lived on a coast will struggle to fully understand. The Norse had a relationship with their land that was different from anything we experience today. We own land. We buy it, sell it, develop it, or leave it alone. Our connection to it is primarily legal and financial. The Norse relationship with land was more intimate, more reciprocal, and more spiritual. The land you farmed was not just property. It was the place where your ancestors were buried. It was the place where your family had lived for generations, where the mounds of the dead overlooked the fields of the living, where the past and the present existed side by side in a way that made the boundary between them feel less absolute than we might assume. The land spirits, the Landvætter, were a recognized presence in Norse belief. These were the spirits of the place itself, the entities that inhabited the hills and the rivers and the rocky outcrops and the waterfalls. They were not gods. They were something more local, more specific, more tied to a particular patch of ground. And they had to be respected. A farmer who treated his land well, who cleared it carefully, who did not disturb certain places that were known to be inhabited by the Landvætter, could expect the land to provide. A farmer who was reckless, who built in the wrong place or disturbed a sacred site, risked the displeasure of the land spirits, and that displeasure might manifest as bad harvests, sick livestock, or persistent bad luck. This is not something I am asking you to believe in the way the Norse believed it, but I am asking you to notice what it does to the relationship between a person and the place they live. If you believe that the land around your house is inhabited by beings who are aware of you, who notice how you treat the soil and the water and the trees, who respond to your behavior with generosity or anger, then you live on that land differently than someone who sees it as inert material to be used. You pay attention. You notice changes. You treat the land less like a resource and more like a relationship. I think there is something worth salvaging from that way of seeing the world, even if we no longer share the specific beliefs that produced it. The idea that the place where you live is not just a backdrop but a partner, that it gives and you give back, that the relationship has to be tended like a fire or it goes out. But the daylight is burning, what little of it there is, and the work will not wait for philosophizing. The men had tasks to do, and those tasks were governed by the same relentless seasonal calendar that governed everything else in this world. I want to be careful here about a common misunderstanding, because the popular image of the Viking man is so dramatically skewed that it takes some effort to correct. The average Norseman in the year 870 was not a raider. He was not a warrior sailing the seas with a sword in his hand and a raven banner flying overhead. Some men did those things, yes, at certain times, during certain seasons at certain points in their lives, but the overwhelming majority of Norsemen, the vast majority, were farmers. They grew things, they raised animals, they mended fences and dug ditches and hauled rocks, and did all the unglamorous, exhausting, necessary work of keeping a farm alive in one of the most challenging agricultural environments in Europe. The primary crop across most of Scandinavia was barley. It was the grain that survived best in the short growing season and the cool, often wet conditions of the Norse climate. In the most favourable regions of Denmark and southern Norway, oats and rye could also be grown, and in the best years, even a small amount of wheat. But barley was the reliable one, the dependable one, the crop you counted on when everything else was uncertain. The farming calendar was ruthlessly dictated by the weather and the light. In the brief northern summer, when the days stretched to 18 or 20 hours, or, in the far north, did not end at all. The work was relentless. The fields had to be ploughed, using a simple wooden plough called an ard that scratched furrows in the thin soil rather than turning it the way a modern plough does. The seed had to be sown by hand. The crop had to be weeded, protected from birds, and eventually harvested with iron sickles, one handful of grain stalks at a time. The hay harvest was equally critical and equally labour-intensive. Hay was the food that kept the livestock alive through the winter, and getting enough of it cut, dried, and stored before the autumn rains began was one of the most stressful periods of the Norse agricultural year. Historians have estimated that a single cow required approximately 1 to 2 tons of hay to survive a Scandinavian winter. A household with 4 cows, a modest herd by Norse standards, needed 4 to 8 tons of hay. All of it cut with a hand scythe, all of it turned and dried in the field, all of it carried to the barn by human arms and stacked carefully to prevent rot. If the hay crop failed, if the rain came too early or the summer was too short, the consequences were immediate and severe. Animals that could not be fed through the winter had to be slaughtered in the autumn, reducing the herd and the household's long-term productive capacity. In the worst years, a failed hay harvest could mean the difference between a viable farm and an abandoned one. The animals themselves demanded constant attention. The Norse kept sheep in large numbers for wool, for milk, for meat. They kept cattle, fewer of them, because cattle required more feed, but the ones they had were the backbone of the dairy economy. They kept goats, hardy and adaptable, good for marginal land where cattle would not thrive. They kept pigs, which were often allowed to forage in the forests and were valued primarily for their meat. And they kept horses, small sturdy animals bred for the Norse terrain, used for riding, for transport, and for a practice that sounds startling to modern ears, for eating. Horse meat was consumed in Viking Age Scandinavia, and it held a particular cultural significance that went beyond simple nutrition. Horses were associated with the Norse gods, particularly with Freyja, the god of fertility and prosperity, and the eating of horse meat had ritual dimensions that connected the act of consumption to something larger than the meal itself. When Christianity arrived in Scandinavia, the eating of horse meat was one of the first practices that missionaries tried to suppress, precisely because of its connection to the old religion. The fact that they needed to suppress it tells you how widespread and how culturally embedded it was. Fishing was the other great pillar of the male working world, particularly in coastal communities. The waters off Norway, Iceland and the Faroes were among the richest fishing grounds in the North Atlantic, and the Norse exploited them with impressive skill and technology. They fished from small boats, using hooks, nets, and lines. They caught cod, herring, haddock, and in the rivers and estuaries salmon. The cod was the most important catch, and its importance went far beyond the dinner table. As I mentioned earlier, dried cod stockfish was one of the most valuable trade goods in the Viking economy. A household that had access to good fishing grounds and the skill to catch and preserve cod in quantity was a household with surplus, with tradable wealth, with options. And those options mattered enormously in a world where the line between comfortable and desperate could be drawn by a single bad winter or a single failed crop. And here is something that I think most people do not realize about the Viking world, something that fundamentally changes the picture of the Longhouse as an isolated, self-contained farmstead. The Norse were not hermits. They were not closed communities turned inward against the world. They were some of the most active, most far-ranging, most ambitious traders in the early medieval world. And the goods that passed through their hands, that were bought and sold in their market towns, that occasionally found their way even to an ordinary farmer's longhouse, tell a story of connection that stretches from the Arctic Circle to the deserts of Central Asia. In the trading towns of the Viking world, Hedeby in what is now northern Germany, Birka on an island in Lake Mälaren in Sweden, Kaupang on the coast of Norway, York in England, Dublin in Ireland, merchants from across the known world gathered to buy and sell. Arab silver dirhams, minted in Baghdad and the great cities of the Islamic Caliphate, have been found in Scandinavian hoards in staggering quantities. One estimate suggests that more than 100,000 Arab silver coins ended up in Scandinavia during the Viking Age, carried north along the river routes of Eastern Europe by Norse traders who had travelled south through what is now Russia and Ukraine to reach the markets of Constantinople and the Caspian Sea. Think about that for a moment. A silver coin minted in Baghdad, passed from hand to hand through a chain of traders stretching across thousands of miles of river, steppe, forest, and sea, arriving eventually in a wooden chest in a longhouse in Norway. The world was connected, not instantly, not in the way we experience connection today, but genuinely, materially, tangibly connected. The silk that a chieftain's wife might wear on a feast day came from China. The glass beads that hung between her oval brooches came from workshops in the eastern Mediterranean. The amber that she wore at her throat came from the Baltic coast. The walrus ivory that her husband traded was hunted in the waters off Greenland and sold in markets 2,000 miles away. The longhouse, in other words, was not the end of the world. It was a node in a network. A point on a map that connected, through trade and travel and the restless, relentless curiosity of the Norse people, to every corner of the known world. The fish that a man caught in a Norwegian fjord might, through a chain of trades and exchanges, fund the purchase of a piece of silk that had been woven in a Chinese workshop. The iron that a smith forged in his tiny smoke-filled smithy might be riveted into a ship that sailed to Constantinople. I find that web of connection extraordinary, and I think it changes the way we should understand the people in this longhouse. They were not isolated, they were not cut off, they were part of a world that was, in its own slower, more laborious way, as interconnected as ours. They just did not have the luxury of forgetting it, the way we forget that the phone in our pocket contains minerals mined on 3 continents. They could trace the thread, they could hold the silver coin and know, in a general sense, where it had come from and how far it had travelled to reach their hand. The men who fished did not do so casually. The Norse fishing tradition was a body of accumulated knowledge, as deep and as sophisticated as the women's knowledge of weaving and dairy. They understood the seasonal movements of the fish. They knew which bait worked for which species. They could read the water, the way it moved, the way it changed colour, the way the birds behaved above it. And from those readings, they drew conclusions about what was happening below the surface. This knowledge was not written down. It was learned by doing, by going out in the boat with your father and your uncle and your grandfather and watching what they did and listening to what they said, and over years absorbing a way of seeing the ocean that was as precise as any scientific instrument. I keep returning to this theme, you may have noticed, and it is because I think it is one of the most important things about the past that modern people consistently underestimate. The amount of knowledge that was carried in human bodies, in hands and eyes and instincts and accumulated habit, in the centuries before that knowledge was written down and formalized and turned into something you could study in a classroom. These were not simple people doing simple work. They were complex people doing complex work with tools so basic that the complexity was invisible from the outside. And it was everywhere, in the woman at the loom, in the man reading the water, in the child learning to judge the weight of a hay bale by the way it felt on the end of the pitchfork. And nowhere was this embodied knowledge more spectacular than in the activity that defines the Viking Age in the popular imagination. Boat building. I have been saving this for now because I think it deserves its own space, its own quiet moment of attention. The Viking ship is the most famous artifact of the Norse world, and for good reason. It is one of the most remarkable pieces of engineering produced anywhere in the medieval world, and the skill required to build one was so specialized, so demanding, and so dependent on accumulated expertise that it was passed from master to apprentice through years of hands-on training that no textbook could replicate. The Norse built their ships using a technique called clinker building, in which overlapping planks were fastened together with iron rivets, starting from the keel and working upward. Each plank, called a strake, was shaped by hand with an axe, not sawn, because splitting the wood along its natural grain produced planks that were stronger and more flexible than sawn lumber. The shipbuilder did not work from plans or blueprints. He worked from experience, from an internal sense of proportion and shape that had been refined by years of practice. He could look at a piece of oak and know, by the grain and the weight and the way the wood responded to the axe, whether it would make a good strake. The keel was the foundation of everything. It was a single piece of timber, as straight and as strong as could be found, running the full length of the vessel. The keel of the Gokstad ship, a 9th century vessel excavated from a burial mound in Norway in 1880, was carved from a single oak trunk over 17 metres long. Finding a tree that size, felling it, transporting it to the building site, and shaping it into a keel, all without power tools, all with nothing but axes and wedges and human muscle, was itself a significant undertaking. The ribs of the ship were bent into shape, sometimes by steaming the wood to make it pliable, sometimes by selecting naturally curved timbers from trees that had grown in the right shape. The planks were caulked with animal hair mixed with pine tar, pressed into the seams between the strakes to make the hull watertight. The whole vessel was held together not rigidly but flexibly, designed to move with the waves rather than resist them. This flexibility was the genius of the Norse shipbuilding tradition. A rigid hull would crack and break in heavy seas. A flexible hull absorbed the energy of the waves, bending and twisting and returning to shape, riding the ocean rather than fighting it. The result was a vessel of extraordinary capability, light enough to be carried overland when necessary, a technique called portaging, that allowed the Norse to move their ships between river systems and bypass obstacles, shallow enough in draught to sail up rivers and to land directly on beaches without the need for a harbour, and fast. Under sail, in favourable conditions, a well-built longship could make 6 to 8 knots, covering 100 miles or more in a day. That may not sound impressive by modern standards, but in the 9th century, when the fastest way to travel overland was on horseback, a ship that could carry 30 men and their supplies 100 miles in a single day was a strategic revolution. The men who built these ships did not do so in the winter. Boat building was a summer activity, carried out in the long daylight hours when the timber could be worked and the tar could be heated. But the knowledge that went into the building was carried year-round, in the heads and hands of the shipbuilders, and it was shared in the evenings around the Longhouse fire, in stories about great ships and great voyages, in the casual expertise that a father passed to a son by letting him hold the axe and feel the grain of the wood. I think about those ships sometimes, in the context of everything else we have talked about. The women wove the sails, the men built the hulls, the iron for the rivets came from the forge, the tar for the caulking came from the pine forests, the rope came from walrus hide or horsehair or plant fibre, twisted and braided by hand. Every component of a Viking ship came from the immediate environment, gathered and processed and assembled by the people who would sail in it. There is something in that self-sufficiency, that complete chain from raw material to finished vessel, that I find almost incomprehensibly impressive. Now, there is one more aspect of the men's working world that I want to share with you because it connects to something we will need later in this story. The forge. Almost every Norse farmstead of any size had a small smithy, a workshop where iron was worked. The blacksmith in a Viking community occupied a position of unique respect, somewhere between craftsman and magician in the social hierarchy, because the ability to transform raw iron into tools, weapons, nails, hinges, and the 1,000 other small iron objects that a farm required was a skill that most people found somewhat miraculous. The forge was usually a separate building, set apart from the Longhouse for the obvious reason that it involved open flame, extreme heat, and the risk of stray sparks. Inside, the smith worked with a small hearth or furnace, a bellows to raise the heat, an anvil, and a set of hammers and tongs. The iron he worked was often bog iron, extracted from the iron-rich deposits found in bogs and marshes across Scandinavia. Bog iron was not the highest quality material. It contained impurities that had to be worked out through repeated heating and hammering, but it was locally available and it was sufficient for the needs of a farm. The smith made nails. He made rivets for boats. He made the iron cauldrons and trivets used in cooking. He made the tools that the farm could not function without, the sickles, the axes, the knives, the ploughshares, and he made the one object that, more than any other, symbolized the Viking Age in the popular imagination, the sword. But we'll come to that another time. Tonight the forge is quiet. The bellows hang still. The anvil is cold, because the light outside is already beginning to fade, and in this world, when the light fades, the outdoor work ends. The men are coming back inside, the animals are being secured, the Longhouse is pulling its people back into itself, like a living thing drawing breath. Before we move on, I want to spend a moment with someone we have not talked about yet. The children. I have mentioned the children of the Longhouse in passing, carrying water, herding animals, learning the tasks that would define their adult lives. But I have not told you what it was actually like to be a child in this world, and I want to, because I think it reveals something important about how the Norse understood childhood itself. The short answer is that they did not understand it the way we do. The concept of childhood as a protected, extended period of play and learning and gradual preparation for adulthood is, like the concept of privacy, a relatively modern invention. In Viking Age Scandinavia, children were expected to contribute to the household's work from a very young age. A child of 5 or 6 would be given simple tasks, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, helping to card wool. By 8 or 9, children were performing work that modern sensibilities would consider genuinely demanding, carrying water, tending animals, helping with the harvest. By 12 or 13, a boy might be trusted to handle a boat, and a girl might be competent at the loom. This was not cruelty. It was not exploitation in any sense that the people living it would have recognized. It was education. The Longhouse was the classroom, and the curriculum was survival. Every task a child performed was a lesson in how the world worked, how food was produced, how animals were managed, how fire was maintained, how cloth was made. By the time a child reached adulthood, which in Norse society was legally defined as somewhere around 15 or 16, they had accumulated a body of practical knowledge that most modern adults will never possess. But it was not all work. Children played. The archaeological record tells us this clearly. Small carved figures, toy boats, miniature weapons, gaming pieces sized for small hands. These have been found at Norse sites across Scandinavia. Children played in the snow, on the ice, in the brief summer meadows. They swam in the fjords during the warm months. They ran and climbed and did the things that children everywhere have always done, because the impulse to play is not a product of privilege, it is a product of being human. And they listened to stories. This, I think, is the detail I want to leave you with about Norse childhood. In a world without books, without schools, without any formal educational institution, children learned about their history, their values, their identity as a people through the stories told around the Longhouse fire. The sagas and the poems and the myths were not entertainment alone. They were the curriculum. A child who grew up hearing the story of Thor's battle with the Midgard serpent or Odin's sacrifice on the world tree was learning not just mythology but cosmology, ethics, and the expectations of courage and honour that the community would hold them to as adults. The Longhouse fire was the school. The stories were the lessons, and the children sitting wide-eyed in the amber glow absorbing every word were the future. Now, as the light fades and the household gathers, there is one more part of the daily cycle that I want to explore with you, a part that you might not expect to be as important as it is. The body, the hair, the comb, the hot water, the weekly ritual that gives the lie to every filthy, unwashed barbarian stereotype you have ever heard about the Vikings. And that story is waiting for you right now. There is a stereotype about the Vikings that has persisted for centuries, reinforced by every mud-spattered film and every grimy television portrayal, and it is this: they were filthy, unwashed, uncivilized barbarians who cared nothing for personal hygiene, who stank of sweat and blood in the sea, who would no more bathe than they would write poetry. And it is wrong, spectacularly, documentably, almost comically wrong. Here is what the historical record actually tells us, and I need you to hear this because it genuinely changes the picture. The Vikings were, by the standards of early medieval Europe, remarkably clean. Not just tolerably clean, remarkably so. Clean enough that their contemporaries in other parts of Europe noticed it. Clean enough that it bothered them. A chronicler named John of Wallingford, writing in England in the 13th century but drawing on earlier sources, complained bitterly about the habits of the Scandinavian settlers in England. His complaint was not that they were dirty. His complaint was that they bathed too much. They combed their hair too often. They changed their clothes too frequently. And worst of all, in his estimation, they were using these habits to attract English women away from their less hygienic English husbands. Read that again. An English monk was angry because the Vikings were too clean and too well groomed, and it was making them attractive to local women. The romance practically takes your breath away. But behind the comedy of that complaint is a genuine historical reality. The Norse placed a value on personal grooming that was extraordinary for its time, and that left a material record so consistent and so widespread that archaeologists have been able to map it across the entire Viking world. Combs. We need to talk about combs. The single most commonly found personal artifact at Viking Age sites is not a weapon. It is not a tool. It is not a piece of jewellery. It is a comb. Combs made from antler, from bone, from ivory, have been recovered from virtually every Norse settlement ever excavated, from farmsteads in Norway to trading towns in Denmark to colonial outposts in Iceland, Greenland, and the British Isles. They have been found in homes, in graves, in workshops, in marketplaces. They were carried on the person, kept in pouches, tucked into belts. Men carried them. Women carried them. Children had them. These were not crude implements. Many Viking combs are objects of genuine craftsmanship, decorated with geometric patterns, carved with care, assembled from multiple pieces of antler, riveted together with small iron or bronze pins. The teeth were cut with remarkable precision, fine enough on one side for detailed grooming, coarser on the other for working through tangles. Comb making was a recognised specialist craft in the Viking world, and comb makers operated workshops in trading towns like Hedeby in Denmark and Birka in Sweden, producing combs in quantity for a market that clearly could not get enough of them. The ubiquity of combs tells us something that no written source could convey as directly. These were people who combed their hair every day, not because someone told them to, not because it was a religious obligation, but because it mattered to them. Personal appearance, the state of your hair, the condition of your clothes, the cleanliness of your body, these things were important in Norse culture in a way that challenges every popular assumption about the rough, uncivilized Viking. And it was not just the combs. Archaeological digs at Norse sites have recovered tweezers for plucking unwanted hair, ear spoons, small scooped implements for cleaning the ears, nail cleaners, all made from metal or bone, all carried on the person, often suspended from a small ring or chain attached to a brooch. These were grooming kits, portable and personal, and they were as standard a part of a Norse person's daily equipment as a knife or a fire steel. Now, let me tell you about the bathing, because this is where the story becomes genuinely wonderful. The Old Norse word for Saturday is logadagar. It means literally washing day. The fact that the Norse named an entire day of the week after the act of washing should, by itself, end any debate about whether they valued hygiene. They valued it so much they built it into the calendar. On logadagar, the household bathed. The method varied by region and by the resources available, but the basic practice was consistent across the Norse world. Water was heated, either in the iron cauldron over the hearth fire or by the hot stone method I described earlier, where heated rocks were dropped into a trough of water to bring it to temperature. The hot water was used for washing the body and the hair, and soap was part of the process. Yes, soap. The Norse made soap, and they made it well. The basic ingredients were animal fat, usually tallow from cattle or sheep, and wood ash, which provided the alkali necessary for saponification. The resulting soap was soft, somewhat caustic by modern standards, but effective. There are references in the sagas and in later medieval Scandinavian texts to soap being a valued household product, and soap making was another of the domestic skills that fell within the domain of the Husfreyja. In Iceland, where geothermal activity created natural hot springs, bathing took on an additional dimension that I find genuinely enviable. The hot springs, heated by volcanic activity beneath the surface, provided a year-round source of hot water that required no fuel and no preparation. You simply walked to the spring and got in. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Icelandic farms were deliberately sited near hot springs, and that the springs were used not only for bathing but for washing clothes and for the preparation of dairy products, since the warm water could be used to heat milk for Skyr production. Imagine that for a moment. It is a dark winter evening in Iceland. The temperature outside is well below freezing. The wind is howling across the lava fields, and you walk 100 yards from your longhouse to a pool of naturally heated water, steaming in the cold air, and you lower yourself into it. The heat seeps into your muscles, into your bones, into the accumulated tension and exhaustion of a week of physical work. Above you, the northern lights are moving across the sky in slow green curtains, and you are warm. Genuinely, thoroughly, perfectly warm. I do not know about you, but I find that image almost unbearably appealing. The Norse also practiced a form of steam bathing that predates and parallels the Finnish sauna tradition. A small structure, sometimes a separate building, sometimes a partitioned section of a larger one, was heated by pouring water over hot stones, creating dense clouds of steam. You sat in the steam, sweated, scrubbed your skin, and emerged feeling, presumably, like a new person. The practice is referenced in the sagas, where characters are described as going to the bathhouse, and archaeological evidence for dedicated bath structures has been found at several Norse sites. There is one more detail about Viking hygiene that I want to share with you, because it is small and specific, and it captures something about these people that I think is easy to miss in the larger narrative. Hair colour. The Norse, particularly the men, were known to bleach their hair using a strong lye soap, a more alkaline version of the regular soap, that lightened dark hair to a reddish or golden blonde. The practice is documented in multiple sources, and it served a dual purpose. The lye killed head lice, which were a persistent and universal problem in the medieval world, and it produced a lighter hair colour that was considered attractive. So, a people who bathed weekly, who combed their hair daily, who carried personal grooming kits, who made and used soap, who bleached their hair, who soaked in hot springs, who built dedicated bathhouses. These are the people we've spent centuries calling dirty barbarians. I find that quietly infuriating, and also somehow deeply satisfying to correct. The bath is finished, the hair is combed, clean clothes have been put on, woolen tunics and trousers for the men, long woolen dresses and aprons for the women, all of it produced on the warp-weighted loom by the women of the household. The longhouse smells of clean wool and wood smoke and the faint herb scent of the lye soap. And now the evening is descending. The thin daylight, what there was of it, is fading. The fire has been built up again, the flames higher now than they have been all day, casting long dancing shadows against the curved timber walls and the dark underside of the turf roof. The household is gathering, the animals are settled, the last outdoor tasks are done, and something is about to happen in this longhouse that is, in my honest opinion, one of the most extraordinary cultural practices in all of human history. Someone is about to tell a story. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you sat in a room with other people and just listened to someone talk? Not a podcast through earbuds, not a YouTube video on a screen, not a TED talk in an auditorium, just someone sitting near you, looking at you, using only their voice and their memory to build a world inside your head. If you are like most people living in the 21st century, the honest answer is probably that you cannot remember. And that is not a criticism. It is simply a reflection of how completely the technologies of entertainment have changed the way we receive stories. But for the people sitting around the long hearth of this Viking Longhouse on a dark winter evening in the year 870, the human voice was the only technology of entertainment that existed, and what they did with it was extraordinary. The evening meal, the second and final meal of the day, called Dagverdr, the night meal had been eaten. It was similar to the morning meal, perhaps with the addition of whatever meat was available, a piece of smoked lamb, a bowl of stew made from whatever the day had provided. The bowls were cleared, the ale was poured, and the household settled into the particular configuration that the evening demanded. Bodies arranged along the raised platforms and the benches near the fire, children tucked close, the thralls sitting further back but still within earshot. Let me linger on that meal for a moment, because the transition from work to rest, from the cold outside to the warmth inside, from the demands of the day to the quiet of the evening, was not just a change of activity. It was a shift in the entire atmosphere of the Longhouse, and I think it is worth feeling. The smell in the Longhouse at the evening meal was layered in a way that is hard to describe, but easy to imagine once you know the elements. Wood smoke, always, the permanent bass note of every moment spent inside these walls. On top of that, the rich, fatty, deeply savoury smell of whatever had been simmering in the iron cauldron, mutton stew most likely in a Norwegian household, the meat cooked slowly with whatever root vegetables were available, turnips, wild onions, perhaps a handful of the dried herbs that the Husfreyja kept in small cloth bags hung from the rafters, the smell of ale, yeasty and slightly sour, the faint, clean, waxy smell of the tallow lamps that might be lit on a special evening, small stone dishes filled with rendered animal fat with a twisted moss wick, producing a dim yellowish light that supplemented the fire. The sound was equally distinctive. The low crackle and hiss of the fire, the murmur of voices, adults talking in the measured, unhurried cadence of people who have nothing left to accomplish today. The occasional clatter of a wooden bowl, or the clink of a stone cup being set down. A child's voice asking something. A dog, if the household kept one, settling by the warmth of the hearth with a sigh. And underneath everything, constant and unignorable, the wind outside pressing against the turf walls. The ale was served from a communal vessel, poured into individual cups or passed around in a shared drinking horn. The drinking horn, that curved, polished horn of cattle or goat, is one of those objects that has been so thoroughly romanticized in popular culture that it is hard to see it clearly. But in its original context it was simply a cup, a practical, available, easily made cup that happened to be shaped in a way that prevented you from setting it down, which meant that once you picked it up you had to drink or pass it along. Some historians have suggested that this was deliberate, that the inability to set the horn down encouraged sharing and sociability. I do not know if that is true, but I like the idea. The food was eaten with wooden spoons and with the hands. Knives were carried by everyone, men and women, on the belt, and were used at meals to cut meat and bread. There were no forks. The same knife that served at the table served as a general utility tool throughout the day, cutting rope, whittling wood, cleaning fish, slicing cheese. It was the single most essential personal possession, and a good knife, well forged and well maintained, was valued accordingly. The etiquette of the meal was simpler than what we saw in the colonial American household we have visited in other stories, but it was not absent. The head of the household ate first. The best portions were offered to the most honoured members. Guests, if present, were served before the family, and the thralls waited. And then someone spoke. In a chieftain's hall, this someone might have been a skald, a professional poet of extraordinary skill and training, whose role in Norse society was unlike anything in the modern world. The skald was not simply an entertainer, though he certainly entertained. He was a historian, a legal witness, a keeper of memory, a political commentator, and a spiritual intermediary, all wrapped in the formal, intricate, demanding art of Old Norse poetry. The poetry that the skalds composed was not free verse. It was not casual storytelling. It was some of the most technically complex verse ever produced in any language, governed by strict rules of meter, alliteration, and a system of metaphorical substitution called kennings that turned simple concepts into elaborate multi-layered images. The sea was not the sea. It was the whale road. Gold was not gold. It was the fire of the serpent's bed, because serpents in Norse mythology guarded hoards of treasure. A warrior was not a warrior. He was a feeder of ravens. These kennings were not decoration. They were the structural material of the poetry itself, and understanding them required a depth of cultural knowledge that the audience was expected to possess. When the skald spoke of the Swan's Road, everyone in that longhouse knew he meant the sea. When he spoke of the wound hoe, they knew he meant a sword. The poetry was a shared language, a code that bound the community together through common understanding of a tradition that stretched back centuries. But skalds were expensive. They were the privilege of the wealthy, of the chieftains and the kings. In an ordinary farmer's longhouse, the storytelling was done by the family itself, by the oldest members of the household who carried the stories in their memory, or by a visitor passing through who brought news and tales from other places. And the stories they told, the ones that mattered most, the ones that were repeated and refined and passed down through generations, until they were eventually written down in the 12th and 13th centuries, were the sagas. I need to be careful here because the word saga has been so thoroughly absorbed into modern English that it has lost most of its original meaning. We use it casually to describe any long story. But the Icelandic sagas, the great prose narratives that were composed and transmitted orally for centuries before they were committed to parchment, are something else entirely. They are among the finest narrative literature produced anywhere in the medieval world, comparable in their psychological depth and their unflinching realism to anything written in Europe before the modern novel. The sagas told stories of families, of feuds, of love and betrayal, and honour and revenge. They told stories of voyages, of settlements, of legal disputes that escalated into violence and violence that was resolved through law. They were not fairy tales. They were not romances. They were, in a very real sense, histories, accounts of what had happened to real people in real places, told with a precision and a restraint that modern readers often find startling. The narrative voice of the sagas is one of the most distinctive in all of literature. It is flat. It is neutral. It does not editorialize. It does not tell you how to feel about what is happening. A character kills another character, and the saga simply says, he struck him with his axe and he fell dead. There is no commentary, no moral judgment, no emotional direction. The reader, or in the original context the listener, is left to draw their own conclusions. I find that restraint remarkable. In an age when our stories are saturated with emotional instruction, when every narrative seems designed to tell us exactly what to feel and when to feel it, there is something bracing and deeply respectful about a storytelling tradition that trusts its audience to have its own reactions. But the evening was not all stories. There were games. The Norse played board games with the dedication that the archaeological record makes abundantly clear. The game called Nefertifel, sometimes translated as King's Table, was played across the entire Viking world. It was a strategy game, played on a checkered board with two unequal sides, one player defending a king piece in the centre, the other attacking from the edges. It was a game of asymmetric warfare, and it required the same kind of tactical thinking that would serve you well on a battlefield or in a negotiation. Nefertafel boards and pieces have been found in Viking graves, in longhouse ruins, in trading settlements, and in colonial outposts from Dublin to Greenland. Some are crude, scratched into flat stones with simple pebble pieces. Others are elaborate, carved from whalebone or walrus ivory, clearly the possessions of wealthy households. The game was played by men and women, by adults and children. It was so popular that it appears in the sagas as a recurring motif, a metaphor for the strategic thinking that the Norse valued in their leaders. There were also dice, made from bone. There were riddles, a form of entertainment that the Norse shared with many other cultures, but that held a particular place of honour in their tradition. A good riddle was not just amusing. It was a test of intelligence, a proof that you could think laterally, that you could see the world from unexpected angles. In the mythology, the god Odin himself was a riddler, and the ability to pose and solve riddles was associated with wisdom of the highest order. Music, too, filled the evenings, though the evidence for Norse musical instruments is sparser than we might wish. Small lyres, stringed instruments with a few strings stretched across a wooden frame, have been found at several sites. Bone flutes, simple tubes with finger holes, appear occasionally. The music they produced was probably simple by modern standards, a few notes, a repetitive melody, something to accompany a voice rather than to stand alone. But in a room lit only by firelight, with the wind outside and the warmth inside, and the faces of your family glowing in the amber dark, even a simple melody would have carried a weight and a beauty that no concert hall could replicate. I want to pause here and ask you to feel this moment with me, because I think it is the heart of this entire story. It is a winter evening. The fire is burning. The smoke hangs in the rafters. The ale has been poured. A voice is speaking, telling a story that everyone in the room has heard before, but that no one is tired of hearing, because the way it is told matters as much as what it tells. Children are listening with their eyes wide. An old woman is nodding at the part she remembers. A young man is moving a game piece across a board, half listening, half thinking about his next move. A baby is sleeping against its mother's chest, lulled by the warmth and the steady rhythmic sound of the human voice. Nobody is looking at a screen. Nobody is checking their messages. Nobody is anywhere other than exactly where they are, in this room, with these people, in this moment. And whatever else was hard about this life, and so much of it was hard, this moment, right here, was not. This was the reward. This was what the work was for. Not survival alone, though survival was never far from their minds. But this, the fire, the stories, the company of the people who shared your life, the particular peace that comes from being in a warm place while the cold rages outside. I think that is worth sitting with for a moment, just for a moment, before we go on. But there is one more thing I want to tell you about the evening, about the social world inside the Longhouse, because it connects to everything we have talked about, and because I think it reveals something that modern people find genuinely surprising about Viking society. These were not lawless people. They were in many ways extraordinarily law-bound. The Norse had a legal system. Not a written legal system, not in the early Viking Age before the introduction of Christianity and Latin literacy, but an oral one, memorized and recited by a specialist called a law speaker, whose role was to know the entire body of law by heart and to recite it publicly at the annual assembly known as the Thing. The Thing. That word, which has given us the modern English word thing in its oldest sense of a meeting or an assembly, referred to the gathering at which the free men of a community came together to settle disputes, make decisions, pass judgment, and declare new laws. It was, in a very real sense, a democratic institution, or at least a proto-democratic one, centuries before anything resembling representative democracy appeared in most of Europe. At the Thing, any free man could bring a grievance. Disputes over property, over inheritance, over injury and insult, over broken contracts and violated agreements, all of these were heard and judged by the assembled community. The law speaker recited the relevant law, witnesses were called, arguments were made, and judgment was rendered, not by a king or a judge sitting in authority over the proceedings, but by the consensus of the assembled free men. This was not perfect justice. It was justice shaped by power, by influence, by the number of kinsmen you could bring to stand with you at the assembly. A man with a large and powerful family behind him had advantages that a man alone did not. But it was justice. It was a system. It was the product of a culture that believed deeply and consistently that disputes should be resolved through law and negotiation rather than through violence alone. The Icelandic Althing, established in 930 at Thingvellir, a dramatic natural amphitheatre formed by the rift between two tectonic plates, is often described as one of the oldest parliamentary institutions in the world. For 2 weeks each summer, the free farmers of Iceland gathered there to hear the law, settle disputes, make alliances, arrange marriages, conduct business, and renew the social bonds that held their scattered, isolated communities together. I find it deeply significant that the same culture that produced the Viking raids, that sent warriors across the sea to plunder monasteries and terrorize coastal communities, also produced one of the earliest democratic assemblies in European history. These were not simple people. They were people of extraordinary contradiction, capable of both violence and law, both raiding and legislation, both the sword and the assembly. And I think the Longhouse itself, that narrow, smoky, intimate building where everyone lived together and where conflicts had to be managed because there was nowhere to escape them, was part of why the Norse developed such a sophisticated legal tradition. When you live that close to other people, you learn very quickly that you need rules. You need systems for resolving disagreements before they become feuds and feuds become killings. The Longhouse taught cooperation the way the sea taught navigation, not through theory, but through the immediate, daily, inescapable reality of what happens when cooperation fails. The evening in the Longhouse was also when the bonds of community were renewed in quieter, less formal ways. Visitors were common, travellers passing through who needed shelter for the night, neighbours who came to share news, traders who arrived with goods and gossip from distant places. The Norse valued hospitality to an extraordinary degree. The Havamal, a collection of Norse wisdom poetry attributed to the god Odin himself, contains extensive passages on the duties of a host and the behaviour expected of a guest. A host was expected to provide warmth, food, drink, and a place to sleep. A guest was expected to be grateful, to be pleasant company, to share news from wherever he had come from, and to know when it was time to leave. The Havamal is wonderfully direct about this last point. A guest should go, not stay forever in one place. The poem observes, with the dry practical wit that characterises so much Norse wisdom literature, that even a welcome guest becomes unwelcome if he sits too long at another man's table. But the hospitality, when it was offered, was genuine and generous. A stranger who arrived at the Longhouse door on a winter evening was brought inside, given a seat by the fire, offered food and ale, and asked for his stories. And the stories he brought, the news from other farms and other communities, from trading towns and from the wider world beyond the horizon, were the information network of the Viking Age. There were no newspapers, no postal service, no means of communication except the human voice carried from place to place by human feet and human boats. Every visitor was a walking news bulletin, and the information he carried might be months old by the time it arrived, but it was all there was. I find something deeply human about that. The idea that knowledge travelled at the speed of a person walking or a boat sailing. That the world beyond your immediate horizon was always slightly mysterious, slightly out of date, slightly unknown. We live in a world of instant information, of real-time updates, of knowing what is happening on the other side of the planet before the people experiencing it have had time to process what is happening to them. The Norse lived in a world where the arrival of a stranger at the door was an event, where his stories were listened to with genuine attention, where the news he carried was discussed and debated and retold for days after he had gone. I wonder, sometimes, whether knowing less about the wider world made them more present in their own. Whether the fact that their information horizon was limited to what they could see, and what visitors could tell them, made them pay closer attention to the world immediately around them. The weather, the animals, the soil, the sea, the faces of the people they loved. It is not a question I can answer, but it is one I think about. Lying here in the 21st century, with the entire accumulated knowledge of human civilization glowing in a rectangle 6 inches from my face. The stories have ended. The game pieces have been put away. The last cup of ale has been drained, and the fire, which has been burning high for the evening's gathering, is now being allowed to settle. The flames lower, the shadows grow longer. The amber circle of light contracts slowly, pulling inward toward the hearth like a living thing preparing for sleep. It is time. The Husfreyja performs the last ritual of the day, the one she performs every night, the one her mother performed and her grandmother before that. She rakes the embers together with a long iron poker. She gathers them into a tight, glowing pile at the centre of the hearth. She covers them carefully with ash, building up a thick, insulating layer that will slow the combustion to almost nothing while preserving the living core of heat beneath. Tomorrow morning, if she's done this well, and she has done it thousands of times so she always does it well, the embers will still be alive. The fire will return. The day will begin again. Around the Longhouse, the household is settling. Bodies are finding their places on the raised platforms. Furs are being pulled up. The smaller children have already been asleep for an hour or more, curled together like a litter of puppies, warm and oblivious. The older children are lying still, not quite asleep but no longer fully awake, in that soft drifting space between consciousness and dreams. The thralls settle at the far end of the hall, near the animals. The farmer lies on the platform beside the high seat, his wife beside him. The Longhouse arranges itself into the particular geography of sleep that it has assumed every night for years, each body in its designated place, each person surrounded by the people they have shared every day and every night with for their entire lives. And now there is a quality to the silence that is different from any silence you have experienced. It is not empty. It is full of breathing, full of the small sounds that bodies make when they are settling, full of the low, constant murmur of the fire as it burns down, the tiny shifting and settling of embers, the occasional soft collapse of a piece of wood into the ash, full of the animals at the far end of the hall, the slow, heavy breathing of the cattle, the occasional shuffle of the sheep, and beneath all of that, so constant that you have almost stopped hearing it, the wind, the Norwegian wind that has been pressing against these turf walls since before you can remember, that found every tiny gap and every imperfect seal, and worked at them all day and all night, a voice from outside that never quite stops speaking. Sometimes it rises to something like a howl, a sound that even after years of hearing it can still send a small shiver through your body. Sometimes it drops to a low, steady moan that is almost comforting in its persistence. It is the sound of the world outside, the vast, dark, cold, beautiful, dangerous world that begins where the turf walls end. In the darkness, lying on your platform, wrapped in sheepskin and wool, you can feel the cold radiating from the outer wall beside you. It is not sharp. The turf insulation prevents that. But it is there, a presence, a reminder that the warmth you're lying in is not natural. It is constructed. It is the product of human effort, of walls built and fire tended and animals housed and furs gathered. The warmth is artificial in the oldest and most literal sense of the word. It is an artifact of human ingenuity, human labour, human refusal to surrender to a climate that would happily kill you. I want to tell you something about Norse attitudes toward dreams, because it connects to this moment of falling asleep in a way that I find deeply interesting. The Norse did not regard dreams the way we do. We tend to think of dreams as random, as the brain's way of sorting through the debris of the day, as meaningless or at most psychologically interesting. The Norse thought of dreams as messages, as information, as glimpses of something real that existed beyond the ordinary senses. In the sagas, dreams are taken seriously. Characters dream of future events, and those events come true. Characters dream of the dead, and those visits are treated as genuine encounters with people who are no longer alive, but who have not entirely ceased to exist. The boundary between the waking world and the dreaming world in Norse cosmology was not a wall. It was a veil, thin and permeable, and what came through it was not to be dismissed. The Norse cosmos itself was a dreamlike structure, layered and interconnected in ways that make our modern division between real and imaginary feel simplistic by comparison. At the centre of everything was Yggdrasil, the world tree, an ash tree of incomprehensible size whose branches stretched over all the worlds and whose roots reached down into realms of the dead, of frost and of fate. In the branches of the tree lived an eagle. At its roots gnawed a serpent. A squirrel ran constantly up and down the trunk carrying insults between the eagle and the serpent. A detail so specific and so strange and so oddly charming that it has always made me think that whoever first imagined it knew something about the universe that I do not. There were 9 worlds in Norse cosmology, connected by the trunk and roots and branches of Yggdrasil. Midgard, the world of humans. Asgard, the world of the gods. Jotunheim, the land of the giants. Niflheim, the world of mist and cold and the dead who did not die in battle. Muspelheim, the world of fire, and others, each with its own inhabitants, its own rules, its own relationship to the central tree. The important thing about this cosmology, the thing that matters for our purposes as we lie here in the Longhouse, listening to the fire die down, is that these worlds were not separate in the way that our concept of separate universes suggests. They were connected. They overlapped. Things moved between them, gods and giants and spirits and the souls of the sleeping. The boundary between worlds was thin, and it was thinnest at certain times, at the turning of the seasons, during storms, and at night. Especially at night. There was a concept in Norse belief, difficult to translate precisely, that the night itself was a kind of threshold. The hours of darkness were when the separation between the human world and the other worlds was most permeable. This is why the Norse told their stories at night, by firelight in the dark. Not just because there was nothing else to do, though that was certainly part of it, but because the dark made the stories more real. In the daylight, Odin and Thor and Freyja were figures in a tale. In the darkness of the Longhouse, with the wind howling outside and the fire casting its uncertain light, and the shadows moving against the walls in shapes that were almost but not quite recognizable, the gods felt closer. The line between telling a story about the supernatural and inhabiting a world where the supernatural was simply another dimension of the real became very, very thin. There is a word in Old Norse hammer that roughly translates to shape or form. In Norse belief, the soul was not a single indivisible thing. A person had multiple aspects of selfhood, and one of those aspects, the hammer, could leave the body during sleep and travel. A person whose hammer left them during the night might appear as an animal, a bear, a wolf, a bird to people far away. They might visit places they had never been. They might see things that were happening in other parts of the world. Another aspect of the self was called the fylgja, a kind of guardian spirit, often appearing in animal form, that accompanied a person through their life and was sometimes visible to others, particularly at the moment of the person's death. The idea that a part of you was always watching, always present, always connected to something larger than your individual consciousness, gave even the most ordinary moments of Norse daily life a weight that our secular, individualized modern existence does not often carry. And then there were the Norns, the three figures who sat at the base of Yggdrasil and wove the threads of fate for every living being. Their names were Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, which translate roughly to what has been, what is becoming, and what shall be. They were not gods. They were something older, something that even the gods couldn't control. The thread they wove was your life, and when they cut it, your life ended. No appeal, no negotiation, no exception. Lying on the sleeping platform at night, a person in this longhouse might think about the Norns, might wonder what thread was being woven for them at this very moment, in a dark place at the base of a tree that was too large to imagine, and the not knowing, the absolute impossibility of seeing what was coming, was not experienced as anxiety in the way we might experience it. It was experienced as a fact, as basic and as unavoidable as the cold or the wind or the darkness. Your fate was your fate. You could not change it. You could only meet it with courage when it arrived. I am not asking you to believe this. I am asking you to feel what it would have been like to believe it, to lie down at night knowing that sleep was not simply rest, it was a journey. Your body stayed on the platform under the firs in the warmth of the dying fire, but some part of you, some essential, restless, untamed part, might go anywhere. That belief changes the texture of falling asleep. It makes it less mundane and more mysterious. It adds a layer of significance to the act of closing your eyes that we, with our sleep tracking apps and our melatonin supplements, have entirely lost. For the people in this longhouse, sleep was not the absence of consciousness. It was a different kind of consciousness, and what happened in it mattered. The room is almost entirely dark now. The fire has burned down to a deep red-orange glow, the embers pulsing faintly beneath their blanket of ash like something breathing. The light it casts is barely enough to see by, just a warm suggestion of shape and shadow, the curve of a rafter overhead, the rough edge of a timber post, the outline of the person sleeping beside you, and the cold is settling. You can feel it in the air above the firs, in the space between the sheepskin and the timber ceiling. The temperature in the longhouse drops slowly through the night as the fire diminishes, held at bay by the thermal mass of the hearthstones and the turf walls, but never entirely defeated. By the deepest hours of the night, the coldest hours, the air in the longhouse will be cold enough that your breath might frost if you breathed above the firs. But beneath them, in the nest of wool and hide and body heat, you are warm enough. Not luxuriously warm, not perfectly comfortable, but warm enough. And that, I think, is the phrase that defines this life more than any other. Warm enough, fed enough, safe enough, never an excess of anything, never the kind of surplus that allows you to stop thinking about survival and start thinking about something else. But enough, always, through ingenuity and labour and the accumulated wisdom of generations, enough. Outside the Longhouse, the sky is clear tonight. The clouds have broken and the stars are out. Not the faint, washed-out stars that you see from a modern city, barely visible through the light pollution, but the full, undimmed, staggering abundance of stars that humans lived beneath for 10,000 years before electricity made them invisible. The Milky Way is a solid river of light across the sky. The constellations are so vivid and so numerous that the darkness between them seems less like emptiness and more like a fabric, a deep blue-black cloth embroidered with 1,000,000 points of fire. The Norse had their own names for these stars, their own stories about them, their own ways of reading the sky for navigation and for prophecy. They saw in the night sky not the cold, indifferent universe that modern astronomy has shown us, but a living, meaningful, populated cosmos, full of gods and giants and the spirits of the dead and the great tree Yggdrasil whose branches held the worlds together and whose roots reached down into the darkness beneath everything. And on certain nights, on clear, cold, dark winter nights like this one, the sky itself came alive. The northern lights, the Aurora Borealis, green and white and sometimes red, moving across the sky in slow, silent curtains of light, shifting and folding and reforming in patterns that seemed, to the people watching from below, too beautiful and too purposeful to be meaningless. The Norse had various explanations for the lights. Some believed they were reflections from the shields and armour of the Valkyries, the warrior maidens who rode across the sky to collect the souls of the fallen and carry them to Valhalla. Others saw them as the flashing of the great bridge Bifrost, the rainbow bridge that connected the world of humans to the world of the gods. Whatever they believed, they watched. They watched the lights move across the sky above their turf-roofed longhouse, above the snow-covered fields and the frozen fjord and the dark mass of the mountains beyond, and they felt, I imagine, what every human being has felt when confronted with something beautiful and unexplainable. That the world is larger than you thought, that there are things in it that you will never understand, and that this, somehow, is comforting rather than frightening. Inside the Longhouse, the last person awake is falling asleep. The fire breathes, the cattle shift, the wind presses against the walls like a hand against a door, and the darkness, the deep, complete, honest darkness of a world without electricity, settles over everything like a second blanket. You are warm, you are fed, you are surrounded by the breathing of the people who share your life. The fire that your grandmother tended, and her grandmother before that is still alive in the hearth, waiting for morning, waiting for the Husfreyja to kneel beside it and coax it back to life and begin again. And somewhere above you, beyond the smoke hole in the roof, beyond the turf and the timber, and the ancient creaking weight of the building that has sheltered you through every storm and every winter you have ever known, the stars are turning slowly across the sky, the same stars that your ancestors watched, the same stars that your children will watch, the same stars that are shining right now, tonight, above wherever you're lying as you listen to this. The Longhouse is sleeping, and so, I think, are you, or close to it. So let me just say this. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. Thank you for letting me take you somewhere old and cold and strange and, I hope, a little beautiful. If you are still awake, I am glad for the company. And if you are drifting off, then this is exactly what I hoped would happen. The fire will be there in the morning. It always is. Good night, friend. Sleep well.